Welcome to another PureRead audiobook. It's wonderful to have you with us. Before we get started, please like and subscribe to our channel and share it with friends. Supporting us in this simple and easy way ensures we can continue adding more delightful audiobooks for your listening enjoyment. The following story is copyrighted PureRead Limited, the home of books you can trust. Now, sit back, relax, and enjoy.
Innocent Gambler's Fortune, Regency Romance by Charity McColl. Chapter 1. The morning after the ball. Under no circumstances could Lady Gwendolen Claridge, the Dowager Duchess of Cavendish, be expected to rise from her bed before noon, particularly after a night in attendance at a ball at which her eldest granddaughter had made a pronounced conquest among the assembly. But her granddaughters continued the habit of getting up early in the morning, a practice ingrained in them as the offspring of the village vicar and his wife. Even Charity, the eldest of the girls, and the one who had enjoyed such a triumph at Lady Kelling's ball, rose for breakfast and joined her sisters downstairs. The younger sisters had been in bed by the time Charity returned home, and they were eager to learn all about the ball and her exploit. They had lived with their grandmother since the tragic death of their parents, when they were still children. Henry Gambler had wooed the beautiful and accomplished Lady Elizabeth, and against all expectation, she had turned her attention from the dukes, earls, and viscounts in pursuit of her, and, it must be acknowledged, her fortune, to marry the cheerful, impecunious cleric who had no more interest in her fortune than he had in London society. Which was just as well, for Lady Claridge was so distressed at her daughter's choice of a husband that she had cut her off from her inheritance when the couple announced their intentions. She had come around at last when she realised that her daughter had married for love, and the Reverend Gambler was no fortune hunter. They lived happily with their 3 daughters, Charity, Faith, and Hope, in a bucolic village not very far from the Cavendish estate. Lady Claridge, who had in her day scandalised her own parents when, at the age of 18, she had eloped with the Duke of Cavendish, thrice her age and a rogue, had enjoyed a blissfully happy marriage with her unlikely choice of a husband, and had remained a widow after his death, disdaining any suitors when she had found such happiness the first time. But she was only in her 40s when she became the guardian of the little girls after their parents died from a fever that had struck the village. That had been 10 years ago. It was not long after that tragedy struck again, felling her son, Edward, and his wife, and making her the guardian of the young Duke, Christopher, and his brother Lionel. The Cavendish estate in the country was a cheerful home for the 5 cousins, whose grief at the loss of their parents had eased, although not vanished, over the years as they grew to maturity under the watchful eye of an affectionate grandmother who loved them without indulging them, and disciplined them without crushing their spirit. The London house, which would be their home throughout the season, was especially active this year, as Charity had made her debut. She had made her appearance at court before Queen Charlotte and had been granted the approval of the patronesses of Almack's. Last night, she had captivated the bachelors and attracted the interest of their mothers. This morning, Faith and Hope wanted to learn more of the knight's tales, vicariously enjoying their sisters' fashionable adventures into the beckoning world that would be theirs in due course. "Do you fancy any one gentleman in particular?" Faith wanted to know. Faith would not have her debut for 2 more years, and she was hungry for details. "No," Charity admitted as she buttered her toasted bread. "There were a great many gentlemen there, and I danced all night, but I cannot say that anyone stood out." "I don't believe you," declared Hope, who at age 14 was old enough to yearn for the trappings of a romantic future, and yet young enough to adeptly annoy her sisters. "I'm sure that you must have met someone who is more handsome than the rest." "I will not marry someone merely because he is pleasing to the eye," Charity declared with dignity. "He must have the right sort of character." "Did no one have possibilities?" pressed Faith. "Surely there was someone with the right sort of character and a handsome countenance." "What is the right sort of character?" demanded Hope. "He must kind and honest," Charity said, holding her teacup in her hands and staring into the steam rising from it as if she could read the answers in the vapour. "He must be faithful, of course. I fear that many of the men who belong to the ton are not at all the sort of men who intend to honour the commandments." Hope's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" "They are not the sort of men that Papa would have approved of," Charity answered firmly. All 3 of the Gambler girls remembered their parents, but Charity, the eldest, remembered them best and was determined to hold fast to the instructions her mother and father had given her on the subject of marriage. Her thoughts flashed to Lord Nicholas Dellacorte, who was almost excessively handsome with golden hair that was as bright as a freshly minted coin and dark brown eyes that appeared to have laughter hiding within them, and a tall and muscular form which attested to an active life. Lord Nicholas had danced 2 dances with her, but as he took her back to her grandmother, he had boldly kissed her hand and said, in Grandmamma's hearing, that he'd gladly risk a 3rd if she were willing to let him. Grandmamma had tapped him with her fan and told him he was impertinent, but she had smiled as she said it. "He is a rogue, to be sure," Grandmamma had said as they watched the golden-haired Corinthian cross the room and vanish into one of the rooms where cards were being played, "but some rogues are worth the having." But she had said no more, and Charity, keenly aware that there was more to Grandmamma's thoughts than her words revealed, wished that she had a better sense of what questions she ought to ask. Who? Hope wanted to know. "Don't tell her," Faith advised. "She'll put him into one of her stories, and if she is ever published, it will be a terrible scandal." Hope tossed her braids. "I shall publish one day, but I shall do so under an assumed name, so that no one will know who I am." The dining-room door opened to admit their cousin Christopher, yawning. He cast an interested look at the foods on the sideboard. "I'm dashed if I know why after that supper last night, but I'm ravenous." "Up so early, Kit, went home so late," Charity teased her cousin. "Keeping an eye on you, cuz, made for a long night. So which one will it be?" he asked, bringing a plate back to the table. "The egregiously good Althorp or the notoriously bad Dellacorte?" "You told us there was no one in particular," Faith accused. "No one in particular. Your sister was practically taken hostage by those 2 gentlemen for the duration of the night," Christopher scoffed as he skewered a slice of bacon onto his fork. "What do you mean, egregiously good Althorp?" Hope wanted to know. "Nothing for that story of yours, kitten, mind you." "Nothing," Hope agreed. "Promise." Her cousin fixed her with a firm glance that revealed how well he knew her. "I wouldn't use real names," she pleaded. "Promise, or I'll say nothing." "There's nothing to say," Charity argued. "Then why are you blushing?" Hope inquired. "Exactly. Guilty as charged, cuz. Hope, it's a deuced good tale I have to tell, but if you commit even the details, never mind the names, to pen and paper, I shall disown ye." "You cannot disown me," Hope replied saucily. "You are not my guardian." "Well put, child," came the commanding voice of Lady Claridge as she entered the dining room. "I expect to live long enough, at least to maintain guardianship of all of you." Grandmamma, her grandson, greeted her. "What are you doing up at this hour? It isn't even 10 o'clock yet." "I expect that there shall be callers asking for permission to come courting Charity. Lionel," she said to her 16-year-old grandson, who had joined the family, "would you pour me a cup of coffee? I see the servants are slacking, thinking that I would not be out of bed yet." "That's because you never are, Grandmamma, until it's noon," Christopher reminded her with a grin. "Grandmamma," Hope asked, "what gentleman will be calling on you?" "Don't tell her," Christopher warned. "She's trying to wheedle names and information for her book." "That book will have us all in flight for the continent," Lady Claridge predicted. "Hope, you remember my instructions?" "That I must be clever and not give away any details which could bring me into court for libel." "Exactly. I've no objection to a clever girl in the family, but I do forbid lawsuits. Dear me, what a night." "Tell us, Grandmamma," begged Faith. "Charity has told us nothing except that she intends to marry a man of good character." Lady Claridge's eyes rested upon her beautiful granddaughter, who so resembled her late mother, Lady Elizabeth, that it was almost as if she were sitting at the dining table once again. "Character is often deceptive," she commented after taking a deep sip of her beloved coffee. Charity's features showed bewilderment. Papa used to say that character was everything. Lady Gwendolen had come to terms with her daughter's choice of husband before the pair died, but that did not mean that she necessarily agreed with his judgment. "It is," she conceded, "but knowing how to tell the difference between good and bad requires discernment. Appearances are not always what they seem." "Christopher, your posture is atrocious. Do sit up in your chair, please. You look as if you are missing vertebrae when you slouch so, and you bring to mind some reptilian creature attempting to pose as a gentleman." Christopher grinned, but obliged his grandmother by straightening his back as he sat in his chair. He, too, with his mischievous smile and dark blue eyes that were beguilingly merry, brought to mind his late father, which brought to mind Lady Claridge's husband. Mourning and joy were forever aligned, the dowager knew, but the joy of her grandchildren living with her did balance the distress of her losses. "How shall Charity know," Faith asked, "whether she is marrying a good man or a bad one?" "She shall use her wits, child, just as you shall, and hope too, when it is your turn to come out in society." "And should you fail to use your wits in the proper manner," Lionel said, "Grandmamma will no doubt set you straight before you do anything foolish like eloping to Gretna Green." "Charity would never do that," Faith affirmed, confident that her sister's virtue would always triumph over temptation. The door opened. Lofts, the butler, stood in the entrance, holding the salver upon which invitations were placed. Closing the door behind him, he brought the salver to Lady Claridge. "Mr. Bertrand Althorp, my lady," he said as Lady Claridge examined the calling card. "He would like to meet with you." The butler was too well trained to look at Charity, but her cousins and siblings were not so constrained and immediately set forth a flurry of speculative jests and teasing which had their target blushing. "I put him in the morning room, my lady, and explained that I did not believe you had risen yet." "Nor would I be, typically. Very well. Lofts, please tell Mr. Althorp that I will meet with him." "I cannot say I'm surprised," Lady Claridge remarked as she rose. "He was quite attentive to you last night, Charity." "2 dances, and many a long and languishing glance, while you were dancing with another," Christopher affirmed. "It was a veritable poem come to life." "Christopher, do not mock me." "I'm not mocking you," said her cousin. "I am mocking the besotted dullard, Mr. Althorp. It's beyond me how someone so prodigiously moral can manage to win £5,000 off a man like Nicholas Dellacorte, who is accounted rather a master at cards." £5,000, Charity repeated. "I did not think him given to the vice of gambling." "All men gamble, child," Lady Claridge said. "A man and a woman, too, for it is not a pastime solely enjoyed by the breeched, must know how much he needs to win and how much he can afford to lose. It is when he falls short of either requisite that gambling becomes a vice. Lofts, tell Mr. Althorp that I shall be with him shortly." Lofts left on his errand. Lady Claridge surveyed her grandchildren. "Pay heed, my loves, for I shall follow the same practice with all of you. You may choose to marry whomever you wish, but I will choose our inheritance," her grandchildren finished in unison. Chapter 2. Meeting with the Suitors. Mr. Bertrand Althorp rose respectfully as Lady Claridge entered the morning room. "My lady," he said, bending slightly at the waist in a graceful bow, "thank you for seeing me." Lady Claridge sat in the chair opposite him. The rain was falling outside, and the fire in the morning room had been lit to keep off the chill. The room itself was decorated in warm, inviting colours to ward off any intimation of darkness. That, and the fact that this chamber held some of Lady Claridge's most treasured family mementos, made it her favourite spot in the house. If her grandchildren were seeking her, or the servants needed her, they knew to look here first. "Do you care for some refreshment, Mr. Althorp?" "No, thank you, my lady. I do not wish to encroach upon your time." His lean, serious face took on a humorous expression. "I expect that you know why I am here." "I expect that I do," came the reply. "You wish my permission to pay court to my granddaughter, Charity." "Yes," he said simply. "I suppose you have heard this quite often from others, and I cannot make my petition any more original. But the truth is that I was entirely captivated by her charm last night at the ball, and if she is amenable to my suit, I would very much like to court her with the aim of asking for her hand in marriage." Lady Claridge perused him with her keen grey gaze. With the acquisition of years had come remarkable beauty which lost nothing to her silver hair and the faint lines at the corners of her eye. She had excellent skin and a graceful carriage, attributes which she believed lasted a woman longer than looks, as she had assured her granddaughters when she reminded them to wear their hats and gloves for protection against the sun. But she had more than mere physical appeal. She was intelligent, direct and fearless, traits which her worldly husband had appreciated more than any other man she had ever known. It was why she had married him, when no one thought him suitable, and she had never regretted her decision, even though his age meant that they had fewer years together as husband and wife. "You have spoken of your intentions to my granddaughter." It was a statement, not a question, but Mr. Althorp looked shocked at her words. "No, my lady, certainly not. I would not do so without seeking your permission first." "And if I refuse?" Mr. Bertrand Althorp's demeanour showed concern. "Are you refusing my request, my lady? Might I ask why you do not?" "I have neither refused nor assented, Mr. Althorp. I am asking what you will do if I refuse." "I must heed your wishes." "I see." Lady Claridge's face gave away nothing of what she was thinking, and Mr. Althorp could not decipher a code in her expression. "You would have done well to have spoken to her of this. My granddaughters know that they may marry whom they choose. I permit them that freedom. They also know that while they choose their husbands, I shall choose their inheritance. If they should select a man that I believe to be a cheat, a liar, in short, a bounder, they will bring very little in the way of a dowry." Mr. Althorp looked pained. "My lady, I do not come from a rich family, but neither are we poor. My father is a member of Parliament with, I hope I may make bold to say, excellent prospects for future positions of leadership. He is known in the country for his charitable endeavours, and I support him in those measures, as I assist him in his work on behalf of the government. I am confident that, were Miss Charity to honour me with her assent to marry me, I would maintain her in a comfortable manner that would permit her to uphold her position in society. I seek your granddaughter's hand, my lady, not her purse." Lady Claridge tilted her head as she considered him. "Well phrased, Mr. Althorp. Perhaps you will also one day seek a position in Parliament." "It would be an honour to serve my country." He was good-looking in an unassuming way, Lady Claridge noted. He had a good tailor, one who was willing to let his client's appearance support the sober attire without resorting to the ostentatious extremes, which were often seen in the dandies of the ton. His dark hair was cut à la Brutus, but it did not appear that his valet was required to spend a great deal of time on his coiffure. His cravat was a simple affair with none of the exaggerated foolery which many a young man favoured. He appeared to be exactly what he said he was, the son of a well-known member of Parliament who was highly regarded as the benefactor of a foundling home in London, which provided a home and an education for those unfortunate children whose parents did not or could not keep them. "Yes," Lady Claridge said simply. "Service is a high calling. Charity would think well of him for that." She stood up. "Very well. You have my permission to pay court to my granddaughter if she wishes you to do so. I will send for her so that you may tell her so in person. I would suggest that you do so in the garden, but unfortunately the rain will not permit that. I believe in granting some privacy to a courting couple, but not so much, of course, as to elude chaperonage." "You are most kind, my lady. I do not seek privacy or any act which would mar Miss Charity's sterling reputation." Lady Claridge gave him a sunny smile. "I do not fear for my granddaughter's reputation, Mr. Althorp," she assured him. "I shall send her to you so that you may express your interest in her directly. Declarations of affection sound stale when delivered through a third party." Lady Claridge swept from the room, leaving a slightly bemused Mr. Althorp behind, but he was soon restored to smiles when Charity entered the morning-room, leaving the door open behind her. He noticed the gesture and guessed that it was Lady Claridge's way of providing privacy while protecting her granddaughter's reputation. "Your grandmother has given me permission to court you," he said, "if this meets with your approval." Charity could not help but blush. "I am very flattered, Mr. Althorp," she said. "I hope that means that you give your consent to my suit," he said, stepping closer to her without trespassing upon the bounds of propriety. Charity did not know what to say. She knew that the purpose of making her debut was so that she would be introduced to London society in order to find a husband, the right husband. It seemed that so important a choice was made under difficult circumstances. How did one decide whether one wanted to marry a suitor who had expressed an interest? She knew that Mr. Althorp was, by reputation, good and moral and honourable, the sort of gentleman of character that Papa would have approved of. She wanted to hold fast to her father's views on marriage and take a husband that he would have given his consent for her to marry, had he still been alive. Grandmamma was, in her own way, just as demanding in her requirements for spouses for her grandchildren, but Grandmamma was worldly, and her requirements were not necessarily those that Papa had claimed. How did one answer such a question from a prospective suitor who wanted to be a husband? "I shall look forward to it," she said. His serious countenance brightened. "Excellent," he said, as if she had named the date. "Excellent." Their attention was distracted by the sound of conversation in front of the open door of the morning room. Lady Claridge greeted a low-pitched voice with the drawling tone of the London sophisticate. "Lovely as ever, I see." "You're up rather early, aren't you, Lord Nicholas?" Lady Claridge returned. Charity felt her cheeks get hot and her heart began to pound, as if the fact that Nicholas Dellacorte was nearby mattered. Mr. Althorp looked annoyed. "I'm here on important business," the young man answered her. "I can guess," was the Dowager Duchess' amused reply. "I'm sure you can. In short, Lady Claridge, I find your granddaughter entirely spellbinding, and I have come to seek your permission to pay court to her." Bertrand Althorp tensed. "Insufferable," he muttered. "How very bold of him to make such a declaration in such a manner." "I do not suppose he knows that we are here," Charity said. "He ought to have chosen a more decorous manner." "You are not the first, Lord Nicholas. In fact, my granddaughter is presently just across the corridor, meeting with the first young man who wishes to offer his hand in marriage." "By Jove, it's a veritable race," Nicholas Dellacorte proclaimed, as if Lady Claridge's news was diverting. "I see that I must take my place in line before the next suitor arrives. I will remind you of what I reminded her present suitor. My granddaughter will choose her husband. I will choose her inheritance." "Is that your way of telling me that if I claim that I am enslaved by your granddaughter's sapphire blue eyes, but what I really have fallen in love with is the prospect of her dowry, I am doomed to disappointment?" Charity gasped, and Mr. Althorp's lips thinned in disapproval of such a cavalier approach to so serious a subject as marriage. "The rogue," he said harshly. "I wonder that he has the nerve." "Exactly, Lord Nicholas. I'm glad that we may speak freely. You may wait at the door. Mr. Althorp will no doubt be finished soon." "Althorp, I say. This is capital. I was going to wander by his home to make good on my gambling debts." Charity was surprised when Bertrand suddenly left her side and went out of the room. "See here, Dellacorte," he said sternly. "This is hardly the time or place to discuss such matters." Charity followed Mr. Althorp out of the room. Nicholas Dellacorte, looking none the worse for his late-night revels, stood in the morning-room doorway. He was dressed with fashionable style, his cravat a tribute to his valet's skill, his attire the envy of other gentlemen whose tailors could not dress them in a manner which emulated the Earl. Of Radcliffe's heir, his entire presentation so engaging that the only one who was unaware of its effect was Dellacorte himself. "Why, Althorp," Lord Nicholas said pleasantly. "Delightful to see you here, although, as I understand we are rivals for Miss Gambler's hand, I suppose we ought to glower at one another. But as we are both here, I shall take advantage of the simultaneous nature of my errand. Shall I pay the £5,000 that you won off me last night directly to the foundling home that you indicated the money is to go to, or shall I—" "No," Mr. Althorp said hurriedly, as if he did not wish the conversation to last over long. "My father distributes the funds to several different accounts pertaining to the care of the children. You may give the money directly to me, and I shall see that it is delivered to my father." "Excellent," Lord Nicholas said, as if they were discussing a matter of the most casual interest. "I shall see to it that the funds are delivered to you later this afternoon. Deuce fine playing. Althorp's time playing, Althorp. I'm still stymied by your luck." "Yes, well, I suppose the angels in heaven smile upon a man who gambles for a good cause," Lord Nicholas said. "Your surname, Miss Gambler, is an incentive to every bachelor in London, you know. I expect that, after I leave, there will be a parade of gentlemen on your doorstep." Charity, alarmed, looked to her grandmother. Lady Claridge merely smiled. "Lord Nicholas, if you wish to make your pretty speeches to my granddaughter, you may do so in the morning-room." Mr. Althorp has apparently concluded his discussion. Chapter 3. Lord Nicholas invite. Mindful of the fact that, although she was in the morning room alone with Lord Nicholas, Grandmamma's presence across the corridor was ample chaperonage, Charity was able to smile at Lord Nicholas as he stood back to allow her to enter first. "You realise, of course," he began, "that I'm really here to woo Lady Claridge." Charity burst out laughing. Lord Nicholas pretended to be puzzled by her response. "You laugh. I tell you, Lady Claridge is the ultimate prize in the marriage mart. Beautiful, witty." And amply endowed with a fortune or two came the voice from across the hall. Lord Nicholas sighed. "Her only flaw," he said, raising his voice, "is that she is so dreadfully cynical." Charity could not refrain from giggling at his banter. "Grandmamma would tell you that she is not in the least cynical," she told him. "She would say that she has lived long enough to know that men's pockets and their professions of love are most remarkably conjoined." Lord Nicholas smiled. "Yes," he said, "that is often true. But, you see, I wish to woo you for the sake of finding out whether last night was but a delusion or if you truly are as interesting as you seemed. I wasn't foxed, not yet anyway, so I can claim a clear head. You seem to be the wisest young woman at the ball, and wisdom is not something I'm accustomed to witnessing at such an occasion." "Wisdom," Charity repeated. He looked apologetic. "I know. It's not nearly on par with your eyes are like sapphires, your cheeks like spring flowers, your form that of an angel. I admit that wisdom is not a qualification that shows up among our best poets. But I'm intrigued by the unique, and after we danced and conversed, I was struck by our discourse, or rather your portion of the discourse. I cannot boast of personal allegiance to my own words." "My lord, I do not recall any conversation between us which evoked wise words," she said. Then, her eyes twinkling, she asked, "Are you sure that you are not thinking of some other young lady? In which case, ought you to be at her residence now, professing your intention to court her?" Lord Nicholas's lips opened in a laugh. He had a very fine mouth, Charity noted, with full lips that easily expressed good humour in a genuine fashion. There was no hint of sarcasm or hauteur in his mirth. "I am quite sure, Miss Gambler," he said with a bow. "In fact, as my valet was shaving me this morning, I was inventorying for him the list of young ladies at the ball last night to explain why I was coming here today." "I'm sure that your valet was rather annoyed that you were talking while he was trying to shave you," she commented. Lord Nicholas threw back his head and laughed outright. "Miss Gambler, may we sit? Standing so is not the most salubrious position for making an expression of affection." Charity sat down on one of the morning room's chairs, upholstered with blue silk. Lord Nicholas sat down opposite her. "That is better," he said approvingly. "We are of sufficient distance apart to appease Lady Claridge's sense of propriety, yet close enough that we may converse comfortably. Now then, what do you say to my suit? May I invite you to go riding, in an open carriage, of course, with me tomorrow?" "What if it should rain?" Charity challenged him. "Riding in an open carriage would hardly be suitable under such inclement weather as we are now having." "Riding in a closed carriage would be even less suitable, regardless of what the weather may be," Lord Nicholas retorted. "I must risk my reputation or my attire," she said. Her blue eyes were dancing. "If I bring any harm to either, I shall have to face your grandmother's wrath, although, now that I consider it, a ruined reputation would oblige us to marry without haste. What do you say, Miss Gambler? Shall I call for you in an open carriage, and after we have shocked the ton, we'll make our way to Gretna Green to marry?" "I suggest the open carriage," Lady Claridge supplied, entering the room. "Lord Nicholas, you are entirely too wicked a suitor. If it is raining tomorrow, then you shall sit with us in the drawing-room while Charity and her sisters play. They play beautifully. Do not look so dubious. I would not say so were it not true." Lord Nicholas, who had risen at Lady Claridge's entrance, remained standing. "I do not doubt your critique," he said, "but you must allow that I have endured many an evening of atrocious music provided by damsels whose loving kinfolk promised a degree of talent that was, alas, sadly lacking. But to assure you that I am fond of music, I invite Miss Gambler, and you, of course, Lady Claridge, to the opera next week. Will you come?" Lady Claridge looked to her granddaughter. "Charity," she asked, "do you wish to go?" "Oh, yes, I should like that," Charity said. "Excuse me, but is that in place of riding tomorrow?" "It is not," Lord Nicholas said. "I'm going to trust that the gods of weather will bless us with sunshine and fair skies. Lady Claridge, will you join us?" His lips curved in a mischievous smile. "I thought an early morning ride might be pleasant." "I shall not join you at that beastly hour," Lady Claridge said. "However, my grandson Christopher shall." "Kit," Charity asked, "I did not know he planned to go with us." "He shall be your chaperone, in my place," Lady Claridge said. "You have met my grandson, the Duke of Cavendish," Lady Claridge said. "I have, and he is most engaging company. I shall call for you at the hour of 10. Is that too early?" "Not at all," Charity said. "I am always up early." "Charity is the daughter of a clergyman," Lady Claridge said. "She was raised to believe that early to rise and early to bed is the proper schedule to follow. I do not conform to that belief, as you know. My hour of rising in the morning depends upon what hour I went to bed the night before, but now I must be off. I must pay my gambling debt." "Yes." Lady Claridge eyed the golden-haired young man thoughtfully. "You lost badly, I understand." "Woefully so," Lord Nicholas agreed. "Now you know why I shall be confident of rising early tomorrow morning to take Miss Gambler riding. I dare not risk another such night at the tables. I had no idea that Mr. Althorp was so renowned a card player." "I must have been off last night," Lord Nicholas said. "I generally win." After his departure, Charity said to her grandmother, "You do not approve of such an extravagant loss, do you, Grandmamma?" Lady Claridge linked her arm through Charity's. "As I said earlier, my love, a gentleman must know, before he enters the playing, how much he can afford to lose or how much he needs to win. There is no escaping gambling in society. Therefore, a wise woman accepts its presence and requires that her husband heed my precept." "Can Lord Nicholas afford to lose £5,000? "He is the Earl of Radcliffe's nephew and his heir, and Radcliffe is no pauper. As to his own resources, Lord Nicholas inherited his mother's money, a respectable income capable of keeping a gentleman in funds and in comfort, but to answer your question, not enough to allow him to lose so great a sum." Charity declined her grandmother's invitation to accompany her on making calls. Instead, she went to the music room, grateful for the solitude that she found there. She didn't know where her sisters or her cousins were. The rain, she supposed, kept her sisters indoors. Hope was doubtless adding to her literary endeavours. Faith might be in her room, daydreaming about the year to come when she would be going to balls. Christopher and Lionel might be anywhere. The rain would not dissuade them from outdoor activity. She went to the piano. Grandmamma had not lied when she spoke of her granddaughter's musical talent. Papa had been fond of music, and as money was generally limited in a clergyman's household, he and his family entertained themselves, as Papa said, by putting on their own concerts at no charge for one another's benefit. Her fingers moved with accomplished grace over the keys, playing a tune so familiar that she knew the notes by memory, thus allowing herself the liberty to ponder her situation as she made music. Grandmamma was very free-thinking, allowing her to be courted by two gentlemen, Charity thought. But how was she to decide which to marry? Mr. Althorp was clearly the more virtuous of the two, although she was somewhat distressed that he had played so costly a game of cards. Did his winnings for the foundling home indicate that he was not to be chided for gambling, as he was not playing for his own gain? Was Lord Nicholas the greater sinner, having lost such an enormous sum? Did it then follow that it was better to be an adroit card player and win, so that one could donate one's winnings to a needy cause, than to lose extravagantly for no reason at all, even if by losing a foundling home benefited? Her parents had died before Charity was of an age to pose to them such intricate questions. She wondered now if Mum had ever missed her merry, worldly society life after marrying an honest, humble man of God. She had not seemed unhappy to Charity, but what did a child of 8 know of a woman's longings? Grandmamma and Papa had come to accord, and Charity knew that her grandmother sincerely grieved the loss of her son-in-law. Did she blame him for Mamma's death? Had Mamma married a man of her own class, she would not have been helping to take care of the sick, thereby catching the illness herself. But people perished of fevers and maladies every day, no matter their station in society, Charity reminded herself. Mamma had chosen Papa out of all the men she might have married, and she had chosen wisely. They had been a happy family, even with their limited financial resources and their lack of elegant society. Papa loved God and his family and his country, and he had taught his daughters to do the same. Which man would Papa have her choose for a husband? The sober, sincere Bertrand Althorp, whose father was so conscious of the sufferings of the less fortunate that he supported a home for foundlings abandoned by their mothers or fathers. Papa would certainly have approved of such moral philanthropy. She did not think he would have approved of gambling, despite Grandmamma's rules for its practice. That might have put his verdict on Mr. Althorp in limbo. But if she went by that line of thinking, he would most definitely have disapproved of Lord Nicholas, who has lost so profligately at cards and seemed entirely unconcerned about it. Charity sighed. She wished that Mum and Papa were still alive. Then they could decide which man she was to marry, and she need not be bothered to make the decision. Chapter 4. Walking with Mr. Althorp. Walking in the park with Mr. Althorp the next afternoon was quite different from her ride with Lord Nicholas that morning. When she returned from the ride, Lady Claridge, noting the rosy cheeks and bright eyes of her granddaughter, commented that she assumed the ride had been enjoyable. Christopher immediately launched into a paean to Lord Nicholas's chestnuts and his skill with a whip, as Lady Claridge had already informed Christopher that he would not be investing in exorbitant horses until he was finished at Oxford. His praises did not move her. Charity agreed that Lord Nicholas was most pleasurable company, and she had enjoyed the ride very much. She privately fretted, however, that being courted by two men at the same time might be ruinous to her reputation, so it was with a slightly subdued demeanour that she greeted Mr. Althorp later in the day. "Miss Gambler, may I introduce my Aunt Tilda Nelson," he said, presenting a matronly-looking woman dressed in sober attire. "She will chaperone us for our walk. Aunt Tilda, this is Miss Charity Gambler." "Very pleased to meet you, Miss Gambler," Mrs. Nelson returned. "My nephew speaks very highly of you." "That is very kind of him." "Aunt Tilda helps at the foundling home," Mr. Althorp explained when they commenced their stroll, his aunt walking at a sedate pace behind them, allowing them enough space for privacy without sacrificing her chaperonage. "She is my father's elder sister and a widow. She never had children and therefore finds great satisfaction in helping at the home." "That is very good of her. My father always believed that we find ourselves in our service to others." "He sounds an admirable man. I wish he were alive. I believe that he and my father would get on famously and no doubt would work together on various projects." "Your father is a noted reformer, I have been told." "Yes, I am proud to say that he recognises that. Although many of us have benefited by the tremendous advances made by the industrial innovations which are transforming the empire, there are many, sadly, who are more downtrodden than ever. It is not always a popular stance with those who prefer to avert their eyes from the poverty that surrounds us, but he will not stop his crusade to improve the lot of the poor. Grandmamma says there is talk that your father may well be the next Prime Minister. I think he would be a very good one. We live in tumultuous times. But now that the war against Napoleon is over, it is time to concentrate on our own island again. My father is a strong proponent of improving our domestic realm before we become entangled in the mayhem of Europe. However, he does not think about political ambition. He is a very modest man, I'm proud to say." "He does sound like someone who would have gotten on well with Papa," Charity said admiringly. "It must have been a great sorrow for you and your sisters, losing both parents at so young an age." "I was 8 when they died. Grandmamma took us in, and then, when Uncle and Aunt died, she took in our cousins as well. She has made a home for us. We are more used to the country in Cavendish, but this year we are spending much of our time in London." "Because of your debut," he said, turning his head to look at her. "I don't wish to embarrass you, but there are others, not only myself, who regard you as the most charming of this season's debutantes." Despite her wish that she might appear to be poised and composed in the presence of a suitor, Charity could feel a blush stealing into her cheeks. "That is very kind, but not at all accurate." She said, "So many of the other girls are exceedingly pretty and so very accomplished as well. I am quite the country mouse in comparison." "Then perhaps there is much more of merit to the country than London has acknowledged," he said. Changing the subject, she asked him about the foundling home. He was quite happy to speak of it and all the good that was done there, The children are raised in country air, he explained, out of the contagion and dirt of the city. They are given an education, boys as well as girls, so that they all know how to read and write. When they are of a suitable age, they are apprenticed to a trade. By the time they are 18, they are able to support themselves with honest labour. Are there very many of the foundlings? More than there should be, he answered. London, I fear, is filled with intemperate men and women who do not pay heed to their Christian virtues. We do not rescue all the children, I am sad to say, but if someone comes to us with a child that has been abandoned, that child has a home. That is truly virtuous, Mr. Althorp, Charity said enthusiastically. I should like to visit the foundling home one day, and perhaps help. It would not be appropriate for a young, unmarried woman to do so, he said regretfully. My reputation would be harmed, I suppose. I'm afraid so. The connection between children born of sin and a young woman not insulated by matrimony is too potent for gossips. It is unfortunate, but it is the way society conducts itself. I see. Then perhaps I could sew clothing for the children. My sisters and I learned to sew when we were very young, and we would be pleased to put our needles to good service. Papa would have liked that. You are most kind, Miss Gambler. Yes, that would be suitable, I think. Several of the older girls will be going into service and could make use of aprons, if your sewing inclines you to that mundane but useful garment. Certainly. I shall begin this very day. Charity breathed in the fresh scent of the summer air which surrounded them. The verdant fertility of the trees and flowers lent a heady sense of festivity to the woodland paths, upon which other couples, as decorously chaperoned as she was, walked. There were others, too, enjoying the air, elderly ladies chatting enthusiastically to one another, pairings of mothers and daughters noticing passers-by with genial smiles and sharp assessing looks, gentlemen who were as occupied with their conversation as they were with the opportunity to investigate the female occupants of the paths. It is good to be out in the country, Charity said. Do you not enjoy all the balls and suppers to which you have been invited? In moderation, Charity said. Papa always told us that too much pudding would make us long for simple bread and cheese. I believe he was right. Mr. Althorp laughed. Once again I regret that I had not the good fortune to have met him. Are you very like him? In appearance, I am told that I favour Mamma. Grandmamma says that Mamma and I remind her of my grandfather, but I never met him. Mr. Althorp did not answer. Perhaps he was being tactful, as he undoubtedly knew of the scandal that had enveloped the much older Duke of Cavendish and his debutante bride. Grandmamma was impervious to those gossips who chose to resurrect a long-ago tale. She had been the happiest of wives, she had told her granddaughters, and in the end it was that realization that had led her to reconcile with her daughter's own unsuitable marriage. Women must marry where their hearts and minds take them, she said, adding, as she always did, that wiser adults would determine whether an inheritance would follow. And in character, Mr. Althorp went on. I should like to follow his example, Charity said seriously. Mum had the greatest admiration for Papa. She said that of all the men she had known, he was the one most deserving to meet his Maker with no blemish on his soul, and he was such fun. She often said that when Papa went to heaven, he would have St. Peter laughing at the pearly gates. They must have been very happy together. Yes, they were. You miss them still. Charity could not answer right away. Memories of their cosy cottage in the village, the scent of Mamma's rose bushes wafting in through the open window in the summer-time, the sound of Papa humming in the study as he worked on his sermons for Sunday services, the voices of her mother and the ladies of the parish as they worked, together on projects to benefit the needy, all the daily activities which were so insignificant and yet so evocative as she recalled them, made her feel suddenly melancholy. Miss Gambler, let us stop by this tree, Mr. Althorp said, sensing her sadness. We shall admire its leaves, and I shall pretend that I know botany. His thoughtfulness made her laugh, despite the tears that threatened. Thank you, Mr. Althorp, she said gratefully, but I think I shall be able to go on. Then let us stop by this rose bush, he said, so that I may pick a bouquet for you. She let him do that, aware as they stopped that eyes were watching all around. Mr. Althorp ignored them, choosing the roses which were the most alluring. "There," he said with satisfaction, taking out his handkerchief to wrap around the stems and handing the bouquet to her. "I hope that you will remember this walk in the park with pleasure, and I hope that you will do me the honour of other such excursions this summer." "I would be pleased to do so, Mr. Althorp," she said sincerely. That evening, as the family sat at the dining table, Charity refused to respond to the teasing from her sisters and her cousins on the subject of what Christopher described as an extravagance of suitors. "Truly, coz," he said, "one gentleman in the morning, another in the afternoon. Why not a ball tonight and exponentially increase your wooing numbers?" "Because there is no ball tonight," she answered with alacrity. "Or you would be enticing yet more gentlemen to call upon you?" Lionel asked. Charity stuck her tongue out at her younger cousin. "You are very impertinent, Lionel," she answered in her most grown-up manner. Lady Claridge listened to the happy young voices with that same blend of delight and sadness that was always present. The joy in her grandchildren was forever mixed with the sadness at the deaths of their parents, who would have so rejoiced in their children. She had missed her husband after his death, but she had been occupied with the raising of their son and daughter. Now, it was another generation to stir such feelings. "Charity is having a very successful season," Lady Claridge told them. "Soon it will be Faith's turn, and then yours, Hope, assuming that you are not a published authoress by then. Christopher and Lionel, when you have finished your education, you will be seeking wives. I trust to your good judgment so that you will be happily wedded as I was, and as your parent were." "Can I not be a published authoress and a debutante?" Hope demanded. "Lord help the suitors," Christopher declared. "To woo such as Hope, in public and in print, would take a man with the courage of Nelson." "Nelson died in battle," Hope pointed out. "Exactly." Chapter 5. Lady Claridge's Advice. "Grandmamma, are you going to bed yet?" They had returned from the evening at the opera with Lord Nicholas, who was as witty and entertaining as ever. Charity had worn her new gown and had known, from the appreciative expression in Lord Nicholas's molten brown eyes, that the green scalloped lace frock suited her colouring. Around her neck had been the exquisite pearl necklace that belonged to Grandmamma, and that would go to her on her wedding day. Lady Claridge, who had been thinking that it was time to take on a lady's maid for Charity, looked closely at her granddaughter. "Not yet, beloved. Do you wish to stay up a bit and talk, just as your mother and I used to do when she returned from a ball?" "Yes," Charity said eagerly, inspired by learning that her mother, too, had been possessed by this urge to share her thoughts with Lady Claridge after an evening's entertainment. "Then go to your room and change into your nightclothes so that you will be entirely comfortable. I'll send Harris to help you, and I'll send for tea for us." "Don't you need Harris to help you with your dress?" "Oh, heavens, child, at my age, I am able to undress myself," Lady Claridge said briskly. "I do need to hire a lady's maid for you, however. You are ready for your own, and when you marry, she will go with you to your husband's home." "I have been remiss in not attending to that task before now. Go along with you, my dear, and I shall meet you in the morning room." Harris was expert at taking care of her ladies, as she described Lady Claridge and her granddaughter, and in no time at all, Charity was comfortably ensconced before the fire in one of the comfortable chairs placed there, looking, although she didn't realise it, endearingly young in her white nightdress and her wrapper. Lady Claridge, who preferred to sleep in garments of a more sophisticated fabric and design, wore a vivid red and gold silk wrapper embroidered with dragons. "Why don't you pour, dear?" Lady Claridge suggested after a tray was brought in with a steaming pot of tea. "It is, after all, one of the things a lady must know how to do with the proper grace." "It seems that ladies are expected to be able to do very unimportant things," Charity complained as she poured while her grandmother watched approvingly. "So much is made of how we are courted by gentlemen and how we conduct ourselves at balls, but no one ever expects us to do anything useful." Such as Lady Claridge, her back straight nonetheless, managed to look entirely at her ease in the cushioned chair. "I asked Mr. Althorp if I might help at the foundling home, but he believes that it would give rise to unkind gossip. He was more accepting of my offer to sew for the children." Lady Claridge did not answer in haste as she sipped her tea, studied her pensive granddaughter, and considered the statement. "Did you not enjoy the opera tonight?" she asked. Oh, yes. It was marvellous and the songs were so very stirring. I could go to the opera every night. Then she sobered. But it would be like having pudding every day, and that would not be advisable. Pudding every day. Papa used to say that. He believed that pudding every day would make us long for bread and cheese. I'm sure he was right, but that does not mean that, having had the pudding, one should not appreciate it. I did appreciate it, and Lord Nicholas is splendid company, but he is very indulgent, is he not? In what way, my dear? He rides, he gambles, he goes to balls. He mentioned that he will be attending a rout hosted by a man he freely admits is not of noble character. He gives every appearance of only doing those things he enjoys doing, with no sense of duty. Whereas Mr. Althorp, Lady Claridge, steered the conversation deftly. Charity flushed. Mr. Althorp is engaged in worthwhile pursuits, she said. The foundling home is surely a benefit to those children who would otherwise have no home and no hope of a gainful future. His father is dedicated to reforming the dreadful circumstances which assail so many of the poor. I believe he is quite committed to these endeavours. I'm sure that he is. I'm sure that with the added income made possible by Lord Nicholas paying his gambling debt, children for years to come will benefit, as long as the funds are used properly. Why do you say that, Grandmamma? Do you doubt him? I have no reason to either doubt him or credit him, Charity. But just as I cannot presume to know whether Lord Nicholas spends his leisure time in pursuits which might be deemed more or less worthwhile, I cannot vouch for the disbursement of the funds donated to the foundling home. Until I do know or have reason to find out, I must take both gentlemen at their word. She reached over to pat her granddaughter's hand. Are you finding the choosing difficult? It ought not to be. I know. Charity burst out with the words that had been simmering in her thoughts during the week. Mr. Althorp is very kind and very thoughtful, with a pronounced sense of goodness which I know Papa would have esteemed. When I am in his company, I realise that there are so many good works which need to be done, and he is already dedicating himself to doing them. Lord Nicholas is charming and engaging, and has a way of making me feel as if I am the prettiest girl in London, which I know I am not. Yet he never speaks of the poor, or of abandoned children, or of any of the many worthy causes which should command our attention. Both men are very good-looking, Lady Claridge remarked. Her statement seemed to be irrelevant, but I could not choose a husband for such a shallow reason as his looks, Charity objected. No, but when you must look at a face every night at the dining table and every morning from your pillow, it does help if a countenance is one which you find pleasing. This comment was accompanied by an impish smile that made Charity giggle. Grandmamma, you have a most outrageous way of speaking. You must have astonished the patronesses at Almack's. They were not in power when I was a debutante, Lady Claridge said. It was a somewhat less constrained era. Your grandfather enjoyed what you call my outrageous way of speaking, and I enjoyed the fact that he made me feel as if I were the most beautiful of all the debutantes. Of course, she went on, I thought I was the most beautiful of them all. But there, I am a worldly, sinful woman, and you are a sweet and virtuous girl. Grandmamma, what made you choose the Duke when you knew that your parents and all of society would be scandalised by your choice? I did not think of them, Lady Claridge replied. I knew that I loved him, and I knew that I could manage him. For all his wildness and his wicked past, he did not expect his wife to be meek. He valued spirit, and he wanted his children to have it. Your mother did. Your father valued it in her as well, although it manifested itself in a different way. She was, like you, concerned for others, and by marrying a clergyman, she was able to pursue her conscience. They were very much in love. I, as you know, objected. But I came around. I was wrong and I knew it, and so we were reconciled long before they were gone. She came to me when she was expecting you, and she was quite candid. She wanted her mother and her child to know one another. If I refused to accept her husband, her family would be incomplete, but I would be deprived of the joy that a child brings into our lives. Your mother never quailed at the prospect of speaking the truth. The very next day, I sent my carriage to their home to bring them to Cavendish for tea. I found that your father was entirely besotted with my daughter, and that her comfort was, expecting only his commitment to God, uppermost in his thoughts and deeds. just as my comfort was uppermost in your grandfather's priorities. That seems very selfish, Grandmamma, to be so preoccupied with one's comfort that one marries for it. Lady Claridge had a bewitching smile, which quizzed and consoled all at the same time. As a wife's concern is for her husband's well-being, she continued, and for her children, when they are born. There are many ladies in society who marry and have children, but who disdain the essential tenets of being a wife and mother. You will not be one of those ladies, for you are unselfish and thoughtful of others. My fear is that you are so convinced that self-denial is the correct route to virtue that you will not require comfort from the man you choose to be your husband. But how can I know which one will provide comfort? Lord Nicholas will divert me, I'm sure, and make me laugh. Mr. Althorp will offer a conviction of my purpose. Is neither capable of doing both? Her grandmother asked lightly. I don't know. Which is why you are letting them court you. Take as much time as you wish, my dearest. You are but 18 and there is no reason for haste. Am I not expected to be married by the end of the season? Lady Claridge shrugged. Expected by whom? I am not in any rush to see you gone. Let it unfold. Give yourself time to know both gentlemen thoroughly. Use your good sense. You will be able to discern the truth of your feelings, just as I did, and as your mother did. I don't want to choose someone who displeases you, or who would have caused my parents to be disappointed in me. You will make the choice of which man to marry. That does not mean that you will not know my thoughts on the gentleman, Lady Claridge assured her granddaughter with a steely glint in her grey eyes. When one is in love, one does not hear the words of others, but remember, you will choose our inheritance. Charity smiled at the oft-repeated promise that her grandmother made. You mean that a gentleman who does not truly love me will not wish to marry me if I do not bring the inheritance that he expects? Sadly, that is too often true. I cannot speak for the motives of either Lord Nicholas or Mr. Althorp. You are an heiress, my dear, as are your sisters and your cousins. Your grandfather was a very wealthy man, and I have benefited from his business sense and the trustees who manage his investment. You are enough of a prize as a wife, but your wealth cannot be ignored. It is all so very calculating. Your father married your mother, knowing that I had threatened to cut her off if she wed him. After we reconciled, he refused her money. I came to your grandfather with no dowry at all. My parents were well born, but we were poor, and it was a struggle for my father to afford my debut. They were disappointed in my choice, but they did come around. Choose wisely, child, but do not abjure joy from your selection. For money may not last and looks certainly do not, but joy endures. Chapter 6. The Cousins Confide. Lord Nicholas winced as he emerged from his carriage into the bright sunlight of the day. Late hours the night before, an excess of the Viscount de Chines' very potent brandy, and another loss at cards to Bertrand Althorp did not make the presence of the sun, or even daylight itself, particularly appealing. But he had promised young Christopher Claridge that he would accompany him to Tattersall's to look over the horses. "Lord Nicholas," Christopher called as he spotted the nobleman. Lord Nicholas winced again. "Softly, lad, softly. My head assails me." "And your purse, too, I should think." Christopher, who had learned of the night's exploits, saw no reason to pretend that he was not aware of what had happened. "Yes, but my purse does not throb. It is my head which is the matter. A word of warning to you, Kit. When you taste a brandy that is so sublime that it makes you want another glass right away, disdain it. Turn away. It was probably smuggled in anyway. Let its illegal provenance guide you." "Then why did you drink it knowing all that?" Christopher inquired, laughing. "I am your elder, and at the age of 7 and 20, I'm mired in my vices. You are young, and there is still hope for you. If you wish to court my cousin, I hope that you will find reason for hope within yourself. Now come over here. There is a magnificent stallion that I wish you to see." Several hours later, the horses having been examined, and the stallion pronounced magnificent indeed, but too intemperate for someone who would be going off to Oxford in the autumn and would not have the time to devote to his taming, Lord Nicholas invited Christopher to join him at his club. "I am rather hungry," Christopher admitted, who had gone riding with his brother in the late morning and not having eaten since early morning. Lord Nicholas winced. "I am not at all sure that I am strong enough for the sight and smell of food," he said. "However, You may dine, and I will ward off the effects with coffee. It is reputed to have marvellous medicinal properties for a man suffering from the malady of overindulgence. I have never found it to be so, but I am game for the attempt. Lord Nicholas was greeted warmly by his friends as they chaffed him for his condition and for his losses. Lord Nicholas pleaded that his head did not allow him to respond in the manner in which their comments warranted, and he and Christopher found chairs in a less conspicuous location where, Lord Nicholas said, his head would not be buffeted by the hilarity of his friends. Christopher found the meat pie and ale to be quite to his liking, as he tucked into the meal with a zeal which inspired Lord Nicholas to sigh. "You are a model of deportment, young Kit," he said. "There you are, eating with the vigour of a lion while I drink my coffee and lament the night before. Tell me, is that what comes of being raised by Lady Claridge, who is a most formidable woman, or of being cousin to the daughter of a vicar?" Christopher grinned. "You are courting Charity, my lord. What do you think she will say when she learns of your condition?" "I am not due to see Miss Gambler until tomorrow evening, when we go riding along Rotten Row, and by then I shall be quite myself again, perhaps even reformed. I shall vow to abstain from strong liquor and cards, and the entertainments offered at the homes of dissolute companion." "Is Mr. Althorp a dissolute companion?" "Mr. Althorp, so London says, is practically a saint. Why do you ask?" "He's courting Charity too, you know. And yet he was also at the rout last night, and he won money from you again. I'm not at all acquainted with saints, but I did not know them to be such prosperous gamblers." For an instant, Christopher could have sworn that Lord Nicholas's mien of brandy-induced distress was replaced by a keen, assessing glance, but the moment passed as Lord Nicholas called for another cup of coffee. "Mr. Althorp is prodigiously lucky," he said. "At cards, certainly." "And at courtship." "You must quiz my cousin on that matter," Christopher said. "She keeps her own counsel on such matters." "Does she indeed? Never a word or even a hint of which of us she prefers?" "Not a bit of it. She is not one to chatter. Of course, in our home, we are all likely to be careful. My cousin Hope, the youngest of the Gambler sisters, is intent on writing a novel. To that end, she scribbles down all that she hears. We have all learned to mind our tongues, else our tales. We have all learned to mind our tongues, else our tales will end up in her journal." Lord Nicholas laughed, then grimaced as his head throbbed. "She sounds a most entrancing girl." "She is a constant nuisance," Christopher said fondly, "and we are forever threatening her." "Perhaps she would be more tolerant of my vices than her sister. Perhaps I should wait a few more years, should my courtship of Miss Gambler prove futile, and engage the youngest of the Gambler sisters in courtship. If you wish to have all your losses at cards noted in a novel, by all means." "Perhaps not then. Your cousin, she sees Mr. Althorp often, I believe?" "No more often than she sees you." "There is some comfort in that, then." "Do you mean to offer for her?" "I am not courting her merely to idle away empty hours," Lord Nicholas said indignantly. "Why do you ask?" "Charity is not like the other society belles," Christopher said. "She is the oldest of the girls and the one who remembers their parents the best. She speaks often of her father and his admonition to do good deeds." "Yes, well, he was a vicar, was he not? I suppose vicars tally good deeds, the way a sinner such as myself might count winning hands at the tables." "He was a vicar, but he wasn't at all stuffy. Only Charity is determined to do him honour in her marriage. And Mr. Gambler would not find himself honoured were his eldest daughter to marry a wastrel such as myself." "Are you a wastrel, my lord?" Lord Nicholas pondered this query. "I don't account myself as such," he said. "It is true that on occasion I drink more than my head can bear, and I pay for it on the following day. Until Mr. Althorp's unaccountable run of luck, I reckoned I was a shrewd man at the tables, prone more to winning than losing. However, I pay my debts. My debt to Mr. Althorp has already been discharged." "At this rate, my lord, you might be funding Foundling Home's expenses for half a century." "Have you been there, to the Foundling Home?" "I?" Christopher was surprised. Why should I have cause to go to a Foundling Home? Charity was vexed because she wanted to go there to help with the children, but Mr. Althorp said it would not be suitable for a young, unmarried woman to go there. She has had to content herself with sewing clothing for the children. Perhaps I ought to visit the home and ask for a tour, since my gambling losses have proved so profitable for the place. Christopher grinned. They could wear ermine swaddling bands, my lord, with your losses. Mr. Althorp chooses his gambling partners well. A faint smile played upon Lord Nicholas's lips as he drained his coffee. Or perhaps I choose mine badly. When Christopher returned home, he sought his cousin, finding her outside in the garden, sewing diligently beneath the rose trellis. "Where are the girls?" he asked, easily demoting the younger sisters to their junior place in the family hierarchy. Grandmamma took them both to the dressmaker's. They are very excited, although I believe their hopes of ball gowns are to be quickly dashed. "Perhaps not," Christopher said lightly. "They will need something suitable for your wedding." "I am not even engaged," Charity exclaimed, then exclaimed again as she pricked her needle on her finger. "You will be, though. I met with Lord Nicholas today." "Did you?" Charity asked eagerly. "I am to go riding with him tomorrow." "Yes, he said so. Are you seeing Mr. Althorp today?" "No, he is away from London for several days on business." "The foundling home?" "He did not say, but I gave him the clothing that I sewed and he promised to deliver it on his way. Is Lord Nicholas well?" "As well as a man can be when he lost at cards and indulged in a surfeit of brandy last night." "Another loss at cards. And drunk. I wish he would not," Charity said, troubled. "Does it matter that much to you, cuz?" "Of course it does. Such pastimes are ruinous. I'm so glad, Kit, that you are not like other young gentlemen your age." Her cousin smiled. "Grandmamma would not be troubled if I came home drunk, but you know that she would find a way to make certain that I was awake at the very crack of dawn, pounding head and all, to teach me a lesson. As to gambling losses, she is, as you know, still in control of my inheritance until I am one, and 20. I cannot afford to lose at cards, therefore I cannot play. To be honest, it does not interest me, all that much. I'd rather ride. I saw a magnificent horse at Tattersall's, but Lord Nicholas said he looks to be an ill-tempered beast and advised against it. You know that Grandmamma will not countenance you having a stable until you are finished at Oxford. She says that you may rent a horse from a livery stable if you need one, and until then, you can use what she keeps here." "I know," Christopher conceded, "but horses are my cards and I can't keep away from them." "What would you have done had Lord Nicholas said that this was a horse truly worthy of owning?" "I don't know," her cousin said glumly. "Gone to Grandmamma and begged for the funds, I suppose." "She'd not have given in." "No, but she'd have heard me out. Lord Nicholas admires her." "Yes, I know." "What does Althorp think of Grandmamma?" "I don't know. He has not said. Why do you ask?" "I think that Lord Nicholas is quite smitten with you, Charity, for all his indolent ways." "I am not sure that Lord Nicholas is at all smitten. I do not think him serious about anything at all. He is not like Mr. Althorp." "Is that who you plan to choose, then?" "You do not approve." "He's so egregiously good, so good that he must be counterfeit." "Christopher, how can you say such an unkind thing about a man who has done you no ill?" "I would say something kind if I could think of anything," Christopher replied. "I can say many kind things about him. He would be a most admirable husband. He is devoted to the works of the reformers. He speaks of them often. His father is one of England's most dedicated reformers. The foundling home proves that—" "A foundling home which is funded by gambling winning is hardly an inspiration to virtue." "I'm sure that there are other sources of income," Charity protested hotly. "It is merely that Lord Nicholas lost so very much and Mr. Althorp, instead of choosing to personally profit from the losses, donates it to his father's greatest cause." "Does Mr. Althorp frequent the card rooms for the purpose of winning money for the foundling home?" "That is monstrous. I do not know how Lord Nicholas has poisoned your mind against Mr. Althorp, but you must not listen to such calumny against him." Chapter 7. A Saint in the Family. Charity wished that her grandmother was home so that she could seek her advice on the quandary she was in regarding the courtship of two very different men vying for her hand. But Lady Claridge had been obliged to return to Cavendish to address business matters which could not be resolved in her absence. Upon learning that the Dowager Duchess was away, Mr. Althorp had asked Charity if she wished his aunt to join her household until her grandmother returned so that there would be a woman of responsible age in residence. Charity had politely declined his request. She and Christopher were both 18 and their grandmother trusted their judgment. Even though she and her cousin had quarrelled the day before, their affection overruled the brief row and the two were friendly by the next day, threatening the younger relations with all manner of retribution if they failed to heed their elders' words. As this sort of injunction only served to send the younger sisters into gales of laughter and inspire Lionel to raise his eyebrows in polite derision, they were all in good spirits. Besides, Mrs. Evers, the housekeeper, knew her duty and saw to it that in Lady Claridge's absence the routines of the household were maintained. "Thank you for your offer," Charity said to him, "but we shall manage very well on our own, and Grandmamma will not be gone so long that we cannot do without her. My sisters have accepted invitations elsewhere and will be visiting with a family friend later in the week, and my cousins will also be visiting friends during that time as well. I do not wish to pry. I hope that everything is well at Cavendish." "I am certain that it is so," Charity assured him. "Grandmamma intends to have a family celebration before Christopher goes off to Oxford, and she is likely attending to that during her time there." "How I wish I might be regarded as one of the family by then," Mr. Althorp said ardently. Charity looked up at him in surprise. He was not generally given to such emotional outbursts. She looked around to be sure that no one could have overheard. One of the maids was picking flowers for the vases in the house. Hope was at the other end of the garden, writing furiously in her journal. Faith was sketching the rose trellis beneath where Charity and Mr. Althorp were seated. "Please tell me, Miss Gambler, if I have even the slightest hope." Mr. Althorp, I do not know what to say," Charity protested. "Forgive me, but I know that Lord Nicholas has the advantage of me. He is an aristocrat with many advantages which I lack. I cannot hope to compare." "Mr. Althorp, I do not compare you to him or him to you." "Yet you do not choose between us," he said, his eyes intent upon her as he reached for her hand. "I am not ready to make such a choice," she faltered. "Then there is hope for me." "I am fond of you." "Fond? Is that all?" "I am fond of you and of Lord Nicholas. I can promise no more," she said in desperation, uncomfortable at the very intimate direction of the conversation. Lord Nicholas never made her feel uncomfortable. "I beg your pardon. It is only that, with each day that passes, I fall more in love with you, and it wrenches me to think that you might choose Lord Nicholas over me." "I have not chosen anyone. Grandmamma says that I ought not to rush into such an important decision, one which affects me for all my days, and that I must make up my mind at my own speed." "Of course," Mr. Althorp said, releasing her hand. "Your grandmother is correct, and I must not hurry you. I may, however, hope that you look kindly upon my suit. Perhaps when your grandmother returns, your family will do me the honour of joining me and my father on a picnic." "Yes," she said, relieved that she was able to offer an affirmative answer. "That would be very pleasant. I shall be sure to ask Grandmamma when she returns. I'm sure she will be delighted to accept." "You do not know when she will return. Forgive me for pressing, but I wish to make sure that I plan everything appropriately." She did not say when she would return. Charity told him patiently. She had already said so, but she knew that Mr. Althorp was a meticulous man who omitted no important detail in his preparations. Such attentiveness would no doubt make him an excellent member of Parliament should he have the opportunity to run for a seat. She was sure that her grandmother would be pleased to meet with Mr. Peyton Althorp, the highly regarded reformer whose political future was predicted to be of great benefit to the Empire's moral fibre. Although Grandmamma seldom used terms such as moral fibre, except in jest, she would welcome the chance to assess for herself the character of a man who might have such influence upon the government. "No, so you said. I shall ask my father when he will be free for a picnic, and then, always supposing that the weather cooperates, I shall provide you with a date for the outing." "I shall look forward to it with great anticipation," she told him. Although his features gave away little of his thoughts, she thought she could see an eagerness lighting up his countenance. She did want to please him. He was such a good man, and although he lacked the quality of mirth which her father had possessed, she was sure that the two men would have had much in common. It was not his fault that his reserved disposition sometimes prevented her from noticing his many fine qualities, and even though he had not Lord Nicholas's cheerful manner, he was in his own way just as attractive as the golden-haired nobleman. He was dark-haired and sober, while Lord Nicholas radiated a joie de vivre that created a unique sort of illumination. They were equals, she told herself stubbornly, as she forced herself not to look at Lord Nicholas's perfect profile that evening as they went riding along Rotent Row. Grandmamma's stable, while not hasting the manner of horses which Christopher sought, nonetheless provided mounts quite suitable for Charity's equestrian accomplishment. She was not a natural horsewoman, not having grown up as a rider like her mother had done, and so she was quite satisfied with Daphne's calm pace and unexcitable temperament. Lord Nicholas's horse looked as if he'd rather be galloping, but he obeyed the firm hand on the reins that his master exhibited. "It is a fine day," Charity observed. "Very fine indeed," Lord Nicholas said, amused. "Have we not progressed past the point where we regard the weather as fitting conversation?" "We could discuss your gambling losses the other night," she said severely. "I see that word travels fast. I suppose you would not credit me if I told you that it was an excess of generosity which inspired me to lose at cards so that the poor children at the foundling home might have a bit of extra gruel for their morning meal." Despite her intention to scold him, she burst out laughing at his sanctimonious tone. "I would not. Besides, why do you think they eat gruel for breakfast?" "I am told that it is the common food for children in foundling homes. I am sure that Mr. Peyton Althorp would provide a much more nutritious and filling meal for the children." "So I should hope," Lord Nicholas said, "meat 3 times a day with the money I have donated." "You did not donate a farthing. You lost at cards." "Yes, but my losses are their gain," he said, his brown eyes innocent. "I wonder that you do not praise me for my munificence." "You are utterly shameless," Charity declared. "To claim your gambling excesses as an act of charity is simply abominable. Despite your chiding, you are laughing." "I cannot help it. You make me laugh at your folly." "Would you always laugh at it?" "I cannot say," she replied. "You drink to excess." "Christopher, I suppose, is the source of that information," he groaned. "Not exactly. He simply said that you had enjoyed a quantity of brandy on the night that you lost such a great sum at cards, and he supposed the former had led to the latter." "Perhaps I need the guidance of a woman of virtue to lead me off the primrose path," he said lightly. She was not sure if he, like Mr. Althorp earlier that day, was pressing her to declare herself, but his style was much less formidable, and she did not feel uneasy at his comment. "Perhaps you do," she replied. "Ah, then let's run off to Gretna Green and begin my reformation." "Grandmamma would not be at all pleased if I were to elope," she said, even though that is what she did. "Exactly, then. How could she object? She would welcome me into the family as her newest grandson and count on your good nature to reform me from a reprobate into a saint." "I'm not at all sure that Grandmamma has any wish to welcome a saint into the family," Charity laughed. "Then there is hope for me," he said in that same light-hearted tone, as if his words were intended to be in jest. But was it in jest? She wondered that night after the family had retired for the night, and they were all in their beds while, outside, a gentle rain fell from the skies, providing a somnolent hush to the darkness. Lord Nicholas had not pushed her for an answer, at least he had not done so overtly. He had managed to deftly declare himself without forcing her to make a similar profession of her affections. What would it be like to be married to him, she wondered. She had been invited to a rout at which he was likewise invited, but with Grandmamma away, she did not wish to accept an invitation which would have her away from home so late at night, even though Lady Claridge had made no such limitations upon her eldest grandchildren. But as the eldest of the sisters, Charity felt it was her duty to be home at night if Grandmamma was away. Was Lord Nicholas truly counting upon her innate sense of duty to bring about his reformation, as he had joked, or was it simply part of his badinage? Did he want to continue to live his life without being reined in by a wife who expected better of him? And what of Mr. Althorp, she wondered. Although he was, it seemed, the better man he had been in the card rooms as well, winning where Lord Nicholas had lost, Would he feel that he was entitled to continue to do so if they were married so that he could provide funds for the foundling home? He had not, unlike Lord Nicholas, ever made reference to any vices of his own. Did that mean that he regarded his card, playing as innocuous? What would Papa have said to such a conundrum? And how could she essay to please her parents when they were no longer alive? Perhaps it was easier when parents made the choices, Charity thought in exasperation, as she turned over on her side in an effort to find a position which would lead to restful sleep. Then a girl need only do as she was bidden, marry and then trust God and good fortune to be happy in their decision. This freedom to choose was more of a burden than a blessing, she thought in irritation, and only Grandmamma would have conceived of such a thing. Chapter 8. The Evil Plan. Christopher and Lionel had gone off to visit friends. Hope and Faith were staying for the weekend at the home of Lady Allengale, who was the mother of their friend Eleanor, a girl of 15 whose age was precisely in between their years. It was a dreary day outside, unsuitable for sitting in the rosebower, and she did not feel like sewing. Disconsolately, she sought refuge in her piano, but even here she felt bereft of solace. It was unusual for her sisters and cousins to all be away at the same time. She had not heard from Lord Nicholas in several days, and wondered listlessly if he had once again imbibed too freely, lost at cards, and was recuperating from his excesses at home. Mr. Althorp was back in London again, and had sent a note telling her that he would call upon her when her grandmother returned, so that they could schedule the picnic he had discussed with Charity earlier. Although she did not mind solitude, it was not her preference today, and when Clothilde the maid entered the room to inform her that Mr. Althorp had come to call and was downstairs in the entrance, she speedily left her piano and descended the staircase. "Mr. Althorp," she said, "it is very pleasant to see you. Mrs. Nelson, what a pleasure to see you again." For of course Mr. Althorp, always sensitive to propriety, had brought his aunt as a chaperone for his call, mindful of her grandmother's absence. But Mr. Althorp was clearly agitated. His hair, usually so orderly in coiffure, was dishevelled as if he had left his home without attending to it. He was not dressed in his usual precise fashion, and although his clothing was immaculate as always, there was something different in his appearance. "Miss Gambler, you are still here. Thanks be to God." "Why, of course I am here," she said in bewilderment. "Where should I be?" "We are just in time then, my aunt and I," he said as Mrs. Nelson sombrely nodded her head. "Just in time." "In time for what?" "You have not heard. Lord Nicholas suffered great losses last night at the tables. He was in his cups again, I'm sorry to say. As his friends were taking him home, he was heard to vow that he can only recoup his losses by carrying you off to Gretna Green, where you will be forced to marry him or else lose your reputation. Your grandmother would be forced to accept the marriage and give you a generous inheritance, or else you would be wed to a ruined man." "Gretna Green, surely, you said he was in his cups." She grasped at this with relief. He could not have meant what he said if he was intoxicated. "One of his friends, knowing that I am one of your suitors, and knowing that I value your good name above all else, came to me this morning with the news. He urged me to come to you right away and take you to safety before Lord Nicholas has a chance to make good on his foul intention." "Why did he not come to tell me himself?" "He's thinking of your reputation, and his friend's reputation as well, and he thought it more likely that you would pay heed if I were the one to divulge this plot to you. If he is a friend to Lord Nicholas, he ought to prevent him from doing such a thing. Lord Nicholas is not an easy man to gainsay. He is used to getting what he wants by whatever means at hand, and his friends cower before his temper." "What temper? He has never been anything but courteous in my presence." "Yes, of course, because he seeks your hand in marriage and your dowry. There is no time to lose, Miss Gambler. I must bring you to Cavendish, where you will be safe with your grandmother to protect you." Grandmother, of course, grandmother must be the one to sort all of this out. She could easily stay here, she realised. It was not as if Lord Nicholas could invade the house and carry her off. But Mr. Althorp's words were frightening, and she wanted the safety of her grandmother's calm, authoritative presence. Grandmamma would know what to do. Suddenly, Charity recalled their conversation while riding on Rotten Row. How innocent his words had seemed then. But had he already been making plans to abduct her in the event that he lost at cards again? "Did he lose to you?" she asked urgently, seeking some measure of sanity in the midst of this incomprehensible state of affairs. Mr. Althorp shook his head. "I have not been in the card rooms of late," he said. "I have resolved never to gamble again. There are other honourable ways to support the foundling home without resorting to vice. No, his debts are not to me, but to another. I do not know to whom, but it does not matter. We must leave at once. My carriage is outside, waiting. I must leave a note for Christopher so that he knows where I have gone." "Very well, tell him," Mr. Althorp said. "But I beg you, do not delay. Tell him that he must stay here and remain at the house and not leave for Cavendish. He can do your grandmother no service there, but someone must be here in case Lord Nicholas makes his move and sends a message here." "Ah, then let's run off to Gretna Green and begin my reformation." "Grandmamma would not be at all pleased if I were to elope," she said, even though that is what she did. "Exactly then. How could she object? She would welcome me into the family as her newest grandson, and count on your good nature to reform me from a reprobate into a saint." "Mr. Althorp," she said, "I am not at all sure what shall transpire, but I thank you for having the wits to take me to Cavendish. Grandmamma will be able to manage everything once we are there." "That is my thought exactly. Now please do not delay, Miss Gambler. He may be on his way here even now, especially if he thinks that you are alone at home." "He would not know that, nor does he know that you are here." "Nothing is a secret in London, Miss Gambler. I know that your sisters and cousins are with friends, and if I know this, you may be sure that Lord Nicholas knows as well. Please, I beg you, write the letter to your cousin so that he will know what is about. Say nothing to the servants. They must be entirely innocent of knowledge of this, so that they cannot give anything away. If Lord Nicholas comes here, they must be able to behave as if everything is as usual." She was not sure why this was so, but she did not wish to have the servants involved in any unpleasantness. She quickly wrote her note to Christopher, explaining why she had left and where she was going, adding that he must stay here so that he could relay any messages, should they come to Lady Claridge. She wrote Christopher's name on the outside of the letter, told the maid to inform Mrs. Evers that she was going out with Mr. Althorp and Mrs. Nelson, and grabbing her bonnet, left the house with Mr. Althorp on one side and Mrs. Nelson on the other, as if they intended to protect her, should Lord Nicholas make good on his threat to abduct her. It was all too fantastical to be believed, and as the carriage navigated the congested streets of London, unable to move very fast or travel very far, she found herself absorbing the tension that she sensed within Mr. Althorp, whose gaze was intent upon the window, looking out as if he expected to see Lord Nicholas ride up like a highwayman at any moment. "Mr. Althorp, are you sure that your information is credible?" she asked when they were stopped in the slow-moving snarl of carriages, none of them advancing very fast. "I have no reason to doubt him, Miss Gambler," Mr. Althorp said, still intent upon the view outside of the carriage window. "I do not travel in the same circles as his lordship, but I know his circle, and this was one of his more reputable friends. You do not know his friends, I take it." "He has mentioned them, and I have met several of them at balls and suppers, but I do not know them well." "He would take care to ensure that you did not meet those of his cronies who indulge in the most heinous acts of depravity," Mr. Althorp said. "I am afraid that the Lord Nicholas you know is not the same with his friends as he is with you." "I cannot imagine that Lord Nicholas would be so brazen as to do what you have told me," Charity argued. "There has been nothing in his conduct to indicate such an action." "Miss Gambler, I understand that you wish to offer Lord Nicholas every opportunity to display his better nature. It will not come easily for you to realise that all you know of him is a sham. He is debauched, Miss Gambler. I know of no other way to say it. His card-playing will ruin his income. I have heard that his uncle, the Earl of Radcliffe, has threatened to disinherit him if he does not reform, but he is so lost to vice that he cannot change." "Ah, then let's run off to Gretna Green and begin my reformation." "Grandmamma would not be at all pleased if I were to elope," she said, even though that is what she did. "Exactly then, how could she object? She would welcome me into the family as her newest grandson and count on your good nature to reform me from a reprobate into a saint." At last the carriage was moving again. It would take them 2 hours to reach Cavendish. Charity was grateful that the skies, although overcast, had not yet produced the threatened rain. Muddy roads would slow their progress, and she wanted to reach Cavendish in her grandmother's presence more than anything. She still could not give credence to Mr. Althorp's dire news, even though she knew that Mr. Althorp was an honourable man who would not fabricate such a tale. It must be true, and yet, how could it be? Lord Nicholas, a man who had always been good-humoured and courtly, was, according to Mr. Althorp's description, a very devil, someone entirely given over to the vices of his class, a man that Papa would certainly not have wanted her to marry. It was at that moment that she realised it was Lord Nicholas who had won her heart. What terrible judgment she possessed, to want to marry a man so profligate in his pleasures that he would continue to play at cards and to lose so badly that he would be driven to forcing her into an elopement so that he could lay his hands on her fortune. Grandmamma had said she would decide how much of an inheritance her grandchildren would be given, but that presupposed that they would marry in the usual manner. She would not allow Charity's good name to be squandered in so dissolute a fashion as a forced elopement to Gretna Green. Grandmamma would sort it all out. The carriage, after travelling for less than an hour, came to a stop. Looking out the window, the view murky now because the rain had begun to fall at last, Charity noticed that they were not on a road heading out of London, but in an unfamiliar part of the area, a section of the outskirts predominated by ramshackle structures. Perhaps Mr. Althorp's driver was taking a different route to Cavendish and had reason to stop here, but it seemed to Charity that he had not chosen the safest location to do so. "Where are we?" she asked Mr. Althorp, who finally looked away from the window. "I have never been on this road. There is another route to Cavendish, one with a more reputable-looking setting than this." Mr. Althorp smiled. "We are not going to Cavendish, Charity. We have a stop to make first. You shall be here for a time, before we journey to Gretna Green." Chapter 9. Captive. "There is no use in pacing about the room as if you will be able to find a means of escape," Mrs. Nelson told her. "I can hear your footsteps above me. You might as well make yourself at home," she said with a thin smile. "After all, when you and my nephew are married, you'll find yourself here helping out, just as I do." "Married? You surely do not expect me to marry Miss Althorp after this terrible deed." Mrs. Nelson shrugged as she placed the supper tray on the table. "He'll have you one way or the other," she said. "My grandmother will never consent." "She will, though. He and my brother, they've reasoned this all out. Your grandmother has 2 more girls to bring out in their seasons, hasn't she? She won't be wanting a dreadful scandal that will taint their chances of making a good marriage. She'll have no choice but to bless the marriage and give you a generous portion for your dowry, or else Bertrand will whisk you off to Gretna Green so fast that you'll think he's hitched Pegasus to the carriage." Charity stared in horror. Mr. Althorp's ghastly disclosure in the carriage had been the last words she had heard before a cloth had been placed over her nose, presumably by Mrs. Nelson, seated at her side. When she awoke, she found herself in this small room, furnished with a narrow bed, a table, a basin and pitcher for washing, a cheval mirror in the corner, and hooks on the walls where, she guessed, clothing was intended to be hung. There was a Bible on the table. The room, although Spartan in comforts, was clean. The single window was boarded up from the outside, denying her a view. The plain wooden planks of the floor were clean, indicating that someone had the chore of sweeping. It was the sort of chamber which might be seen in any respectable home belonging to folk of limited means, except for the boarded window. "Where is Mr. Althorp? I insist on seeing him." "You'll see him soon enough. He's not here. It's a waiting time now, for word to reach Lady Claridge so that she can give her consent to the marriage and draw up a marriage contract that suits my brother." "Your brother, the great reformer," Charity said sarcastically. "How he has duped the people. I wonder that his conscience does not upbraid him for living such a life." "My brother is a clever man," Mrs. Nelson said. "Now eat up your food before it gets cold. We don't waste food around here." "I am not hungry." "You will be," Mrs. Nelson predicted, leaving the room. Charity heard the key turn in the lock as Mrs. Nelson departed. Grandmother would not be fooled by this vicious scheme. She was far too wise for that, and she was much cleverer than Mr. Peyton Althorp could ever hope to be. She would call the law on the Althorp. Kidnapping was certainly against the law in England, and once grandmother had alerted the authorities that her granddaughter had been kidnapped by a member of Parliament and his son, the constables would be out in force. How would they know where she was? How could they find her when she didn't even know where she was and had no way of contacting anyone? Mr. Althorp would go to great pains to keep her concealment a secret until he had achieved his end. When Christopher arrived home, he would see the note accusing Lord Nicholas of the very crime which Mr. Althorp had devised. He would notify Grandmamma, and hours, perhaps days, would be wasted while the confusion was untangled. In the meantime, her family would wonder where she was. They would worry, but until they received Mr. Althorp's instructions, they would not know what to do. She would be trapped here, alone and friendless, a victim of a cruel ploy to force her into marriage so that the Althorps would have access to Cavendish money. Charity felt the pressure of a sob trying to emerge from her throat, but she forced it down. She would not give way to vapours. Now was the time for rational thinking, not hysteria. Papa had frequently lauded Mamma for her common sense and forethought. She had, he often said, a mind equal to that of any scholar in Christendom. What was needed now was not scholarly thinking, but an unfaltering scrutiny of the facts as she understood them to be. She had wickedly believed Mr. Althorp's accusations against Lord Nicholas, who was, she realised, quite innocent of any attempt to kidnap her and force her to marry him. If the authorities acted upon the details in the note that she had left for Christopher, they would find him at his residence as expected. Inquiries made of his friends would reveal that no one had gone to Mr. Althorp with the tale that Mr. Althorp had told her, and she had foolishly believed. Mr. Althorp would be absent from London, no doubt, but he would be obliged to contact Grandmamma, as Mrs. Nelson had said, in order to put his scheme into play. He would not force a marriage until he was assured that her dowry would be a generous one, and that would take time. Grandmamma would not relish being coerced into capitulating to Mr. Althorp's demands, but she would not risk the futures of her younger granddaughters. But would she sacrifice Charity's happiness in order to preserve the marital options for Faith and Hope? Charity sat down at the table. The food on the tray was simple enough: bread, meat, cheese, fruit, and a pot of tea, but she had no appetite. The plate and cup were clean, the fork and knife likewise, so whatever the function of this place, it did not lack for standards. Where was she? She could hear sounds from the rooms below, but she could not discern the words, except that there seemed to be activity rather than silence downstairs. She heard noises from outside as well, but with the window boarded up, she had no idea what might be the source. There were muffled voices, but also the sounds of animals. Was she in a farmhouse? She did not hear city sounds such as she had grown accustomed to from the house in London. Therefore, she must be somewhere out in the country. Her memory of the scene outside the window when the carriage first arrived at this place was vague. The rain had begun to fall, she recalled, obscuring the view. Yet she recalled the sight of derelict buildings that, from their outward appearance, looked to be abandoned. She had not noticed any people there. She must have been chloroformed, she supposed, by Mrs. Nelson and brought into this house without being conscious and therefore unable to identify her habitation. It was a chillingly premeditated plan, revealing a calculating nature that she had failed to detect in her meetings with Mr. Althorp. How had she been so easily convinced that he was a man of virtue and probity, someone that Papa would have held in high regard? She knew nothing of him. Nothing except that he was exceedingly skilled at playing and winning at cards. She had concentrated her disapproval on Lord Nicholas's losses rather than recognising that the two men were equally at fault for gambling. Grandmamma's practical observation that all men gambled and that it was acceptable to do so as long as a man knew how much he could afford to lose and how much he needed to win represented a stark but acute appraisal of the situation. Perhaps Lord Nicholas had been able to afford his losses. She had not considered the matter from that angle, although Grandmamma had said that his inheritance from his late mother was ample for his needs, but not for such extravagance as losses at cards. But it was quite obvious that Mr. Althorp knew how much he needed to win. He claimed that the winnings were donated to the operation of the foundling home that his father had founded. Was that true? Even if it was, it did not absolve him of kidnapping her with the aim of forcing Grandmamma to provide a generous settlement along with consenting to a marriage that, Charity knew her grandmother would never accept. Although she was not hungry, Charity was thirsty. She poured tea into the cup that was on the tray and stirred milk and sugar into the brew. It was very strong, but the taste not altered, giving her hope that it was simply tea. She could not tell the time, but estimated that several hours had passed when the key turned in the door. She expected to see Mrs. Nelson, but instead a young girl wearing a plain mob cap and a simple cotton dress and a white apron entered the room. "Oh, miss," she said, "you haven't eaten your supper." "I am not hungry." "They'll be ever so angry if you haven't eaten, miss. See here, you take the food from the plate and put it there, for later, see?" The girl demonstrated her intent by clearing the plate of its contents. No one will be the wiser if they don't know. "Who is they?" Charity asked. The girl looked to be in her early teens. She was clean and her clothing was neat, although shabby and worn except for the... Charity looked closer. The girl's apron was new, quite new. It was one of the aprons that she had sewn for the foundling home after Mr. Althorp had explained that the older girls who were going into service needed the garments for their work. She had happily acquiesced in this request, pleased that she was helping someone to better herself by finding employment. The clothing that she had sewn was for the children at the foundling home. Was this then? Mr. Althorp and Mrs. Nelson. Charity answered her own question, after it became apparent that the girl did not intend to reply, or perhaps did not know the names of the family that ran the home. "My name is Charity. What is your name?" "Nora, Miss Charity." "Thank you, Nora. I'm sorry that I did not finish my supper, but I am not hungry." "It's best you eat, miss. We're told to eat what's on our plate." "That is very good of Mr. Althorp and his aunt to look after you so carefully," Charity said evenly. An anxious expression came across the girl's face. She did not look to be abused or starved, and yet there was something in her features which hinted at shadows which could not be alleviated by food or clothing. "Yes, miss," she said without expression. "You'll hide your food or eat it, won't you?" "Yes, Nora," Charity assured her. "No one will see it but you and me." The girl smiled in relief. "Thank you, miss," she said. "Nora," Charity said as the girl picked up the tray and moved to the door, "will you be bringing me my meals while I am here?" The girl shook her head. "Perhaps for tomorrow, but I'm leaving at the end of the week," she said. "Leaving? Have you found employment?" The girl's young face seemed to crumple, her lips quivering as she fought to overcome whatever emotion was surging within her. "Yes, miss," she said in a forlorn tone. "You are not happy with your employer. Can you not find another?" "It's not for me to decide, miss," Nora said, opening the door and leaving with the tray. The key turned in the lock and Charity knew that she was alone for the night. At least, she assumed so, unless... But no, Mr. Althorp would surely not be so vile as to... Charity eyed the table. It looked too heavy to move, but she could lift the chair. She did so, taking care not to scrape its legs against the floor and risk alerting Mrs. Nelson. She positioned it beneath the doorknob. If anyone did try to enter surreptitiously during the night, Charity would be alerted by the sounds the chair would make. She removed her shoes and stockings and undid her hair, combing it out with her fingers. She laid down upon the bed, pulling the counterpane over her. It was not comfortable to sleep in her clothing, but with no provisions made for nightwear, she had no intention of disrobing. The room was very dark. Tomorrow she would ask for a candle. She wished to read the Bible before retiring for the night, and she could not do so in such darkness. How many tomorrows would there be in this place? Charity wondered, apprehension joining forces with the darkness to prey upon her fear. How long before Mr. Althorp achieved his aims and made her his wife, or, if Grandmamma did not accede to his demands, before she was carried off to Gretna Green to a forced marriage. Chapter 10. A visit from Mr. Althorp. There was a knock upon the door before the key turned in the lock, and so Charity was not entirely surprised when her visitor turned out to be Mr. Althorp. She was not impressed with the false courtesy which inspired him to knock, lest he disturb her in a private moment, when he was the one keeping her locked in a room. "Charity," he greeted her as if they were meeting in her grandmother's drawing-room. "You are being cared for, I am assured." Charity, who was seated at the table reading the Bible, declined to answer. I thought you might welcome a visit from your future husband, he said. You thought wrongly, she replied, not looking up from the Book of Psalms. As there was only one chair in the small room, Mr. Althorp was obliged to remain standing. Charity! I remain Miss Gambler to you, sir. Until you are Mrs. Althorp. She again chose not to respond. She had been in her room for 5 days. Her request for a candle had been granted, alleviating some of the extreme darkness which fell quickly in a room with no light from outside. She had been given a change of clothing, which she refused to wear, even though the dress she wore was rumpled and less than pristine. She did don the nightwear which was provided. It too was clean, although faded and mended. Her meals were now served by a different girl, who was so timid that she did not speak when she was in Charity's presence. Nora was gone. Charity had asked the new girl her name, but the girl had not answered. I am in the process of contacting Lady Claridge with my terms, he said. I will marry you, without scandal or outcry, if she consents to a marriage contract which my father has drawn up. If she does not consent, I will elope with you to Gretna Green and marry you anyway, at a great cost to your reputation and that of your family. Should she threaten to expose my actions, of course she will never see you again. You are threatening to kill me? Certainly not, he replied, annoyed at her query. I am not a murderer. It is a relief to know that there are some crimes to which you will not stoop. Charity, he said in a coaxing voice, we shall be very happy together. My father will become Prime Minister one day, and I shall run for his seat in Parliament. You will continue to travel in the same exclusive circles which are familiar to you. I am familiar with honour and integrity. You maligned Lord Nicholas as if he were a villain, when all the time you are the one whose conduct reveals you to be a cad. Have a care how you speak, he warned. I am not a man who will tolerate insolence from anyone, particularly my wife. I am not your wife, sir. You will be. There is no place in London society for a ruined woman. You will be begging me to marry you. She looked up from the Bible. You, sir, do not know me at all. Mind your tongue, Charity. Your grandmother does not know where you are. She will be anxious to see you and find that you are safe. She will sign the marriage contract and she will keep our secret because otherwise your sisters will pay for her failure to do so. My grandmother is not easily intimidated. Once she knows that your father is a fraud, she will expose him. She cannot do so unless she chooses to jeopardize the future of all her grandchildren. Your surname will be Althorp. To expose my father to shame would include you in the disgrace. How will your cousin manage to marry a suitable bride when the Cavendish estate is marred by your reckless elopement? To Gretna Green to marry the man you love, he jeered in triumph. How will your sister even be presented at court when the family name has been stained by your conduct? Lady Claridge will have no choice. She will consent for the sake of her grandchildren, and of course out of her affection for you. For mark my words, Charity, if she does not sign the contract, she will never set eyes on you again. I can keep you hidden forever if I choose. You will marry me, and Lady Claridge will welcome me into your family. Why must the window be boarded? She asked, ignoring his topic. It is terribly dark in here, and with no sunlight, I feel that I shall fall ill. At some point in this wretched series of events, you shall have to bury me if I am to be entombed in this room, for I can tell you this much, Mr. Althorp, and that is that, regardless of your threats, my grandmother will never sign a marriage contract if she does not believe me to be alive. She met his gaze with an unflinching stare and saw that she had struck home with her words. You are on the second story of this establishment, he said. If the boards are removed from outside the window, it will be too high for you to try to escape. There is no one here who will come to your aid. Yes, it's a very clever idea, is it not, to locate a foundling home outside of the city so that its presence is not detected. He did not disguise his shock. Who told you? No one had to tell me, she answered contemptuously. I am not witless. You are miles from London, he said. You will not escape. Charity returned to the Bible on the table before her, ignoring Mr. Althorp as if he were not there. After several minutes of uncomfortable silence, her captor left the room. She heard the key turn in the lock. That afternoon, the boards were removed from the window, and she was able to look out upon the grounds of the foundling home. The derelict buildings that she had first seen upon her arrival were on the outer boundary of the grounds, acting as an odd sort of barrier between the home and whatever lay beyond. She heard the sound of dogs barking, and she realised that they likely guarded the foundling home from intruders, as well, she realised, as preventing any of the children from escaping. She remembered Nora's anxious expression when she spoke of her coming employment upon leaving the foundling home. Would a girl be so terrified at the prospect of becoming a maid, or was the employment awaiting her a far more nefarious position? Then she saw Mr. Althorp astride a horse, giving instructions to Mrs. Nelson. As the two of them looked up toward her window, Charity bent her head so that she appeared to be oblivious to the fact that she could now look out beyond her prison. He was leaving, no doubt, to advance on his plan, and from what Charity could discern, his aunt was the only other adult, besides herself, on the premises. She was not surprised when Mrs. Nelson came that evening with her supper tray. "I hope, for your sake, that you have no silly notions of trying to escape," Mrs. Nelson said after putting the tray down. "Until I sprout wings," Charity answered, "it would be silly for me to do so. I am tired of having nothing to do all day. Bring me cloth, needles and thread so that I may at least continue to sew for the children." Mrs. Nelson looked satisfied, convinced that Charity was sufficiently cowed by her circumstances. The next day, when the silent young girl brought her breakfast, she also brought with her sewing supplies and cloth. "Tell me, please, do you have an apron?" The girl appeared startled by the question. "Would you like a new one? I am sewing, you see. I made an apron for Nora. What is your name, child?" "Sarah," the girl replied, speaking at last, perhaps because she was so taken aback by the reference to Nora. "Has she gone to her new employer then?" Charity asked. She did not look at the girl as she placed a length of fabric upon the table. "I wonder if she will find use for her apron when she is in service. It appeared that she took very good care of it. Would you like an apron, Sarah?" I shall make you one, Sarah," Charity said. "I shall make all the girls one. How many girls are there?" 10, miss. 10 boys, 10 girls. Never no more than 20. A new girl will be coming soon, we're told." "Can they find use for an apron? Do you help in the kitchen? Someone does the cooking? Is it Mrs. Nelson?" Sarah's lip curled as if she found the notion laughable. "No, miss. It's Annabel does the cooking." "Could she use an apron, do you think?" "She has one." "Will she need a new one for when she goes into service?" "She won't be going into service. Annabel is not pretty. She'll always be cooking." Not pretty were maids hired for their looks, perhaps in some households, but Charity's intuition told her that the females of the foundling home were not finding work as domestic servants when they were old enough to leave the home. Setting to work, Charity had a finished apron by the time Sarah arrived with her supper tray. Sarah eyed the item with interest. "Do you like it? I wish I had some way of decorating it, but I have only cloth and thread. But if you would like it, you may have it." Sarah's apron was stained and mended, obviously a hand-me, down from a former resident of the foundling home. Her dress, too, showed evidence of being worn and washed for longer than the child would have been old enough to fit into it. "Thank you, miss," Sarah said shyly. Charity stood up and, after untying the old apron, tied the new one around Sarah's waist. "There you go. And will you tell Annabel that my next apron is for her?" "I'll tell her, miss." The next morning, there was a new person bringing up Charity's breakfast. She was thin and pale. Her cheeks were lean and colourless. Her eyes were light blue. Her hair was a dull shade between blonde and brown. But whether she was attractive or not, Charity could not say. It was the girl's defeated look that dominated her features. Charity guessed her age to be more than 16 years, but she could not say for sure. Although Nora had been pretty and appeared to be in good health, this girl was undeniably plain. Charity wondered if the poor child suffered from consumption. It might explain her slender form, or, a malignant thought struck Charity, were only the pretty girls fed well to ensure that they were comely for the employers who would pay for their services. "Good morning, miss. Here's your breakfast." "Thank you. I am Charity. What is your name?" "I'm Annabel, miss." "Annabel. Then it is to you that I owe thanks for the meals which I have eaten. Has anyone ever told you what fine bread you bake? I have eaten in some of the most elegant dining rooms in London, and I can say with all truth that your bread is worthy to be served there. The girl's face turned red. Thank you, miss, she whispered, as if a louder voice would shatter the compliment. Do you ever think of becoming a cook in such a house, Annabel? You know that in London homes, a good cook is the queen of the kitchen, for the kitchen is her domain. The entire household depends upon her skill. Charity was not lying. The bread that was served with her meals testified to the skill of the person baking it. When pie was served, the crust was light and tasty. The occasional scones for breakfast were the product of an expert who knew how to measure and blend ingredients deftly. Have you served as the cook here for long, Annabel? 5 years, miss. 5 years? How was that possible, unless she was older than she looked? Had she grown to womanhood in this place? She scarcely looked old enough to be out of the schoolroom. Do the other children help you? Some do. Others work about the place. We all work. Charity managed a smile. As do I. I'm working on another apron. This one will be for you. Chapter 11. Escape. As if she were surrendering to the inevitability of her fate, Charity put on one of the dresses that had been brought up for her after her arrival. The garment, although drab, had been washed and was clean. When Mrs. Nelson brought up the lunch tray, she immediately noticed Charity's changing clothing, and she seemed to find satisfaction in it. Charity did not look up from her sewing. If there is mending to do, Mrs. Nelson, I should be glad of an opportunity to be useful. Do the girls know how to sew? I teach them the housewifely arts. I'm sure that such talents come in handy when they go into service. Her words appeared to amuse Mrs. Nelson. She was smiling, rather unpleasantly, Charity thought, as she put down the tray and left. Annabel brought up the supper tray, and when she did so, Charity stood up and handed her the finished apron. The girl touched it hesitantly, as if doubtful that it was for her. Annabel, I grew up in a vicar's household, and I learned to cook and sew as a very young girl. I wonder if you might like to try any of the recipes I used to help my mother prepare when I was in our kitchen. They wouldn't like that, miss. I only make what I'm told to make. She does the shopping. I see. Perhaps I might ask her, does she go shopping daily? No, miss. She goes into the city to shop. There's nowhere around here, nothing to buy. Nothing to buy? Is there not a village nearby? No, miss. The village has been abandoned for a long time. There was a disease of some sort and the folk died. Others moved away, I'm told. Extraordinary. And so she must go far to shop for supplies? Yes, miss. She's got all day when she shops. Does Mr. Althorp stay then to take care of you all? We older ones take care of the little ones, miss. He's not much here. In London he is. Do you think Mrs. Nelson might purchase some things on her next shopping day, if I were to ask her? Annabel looked doubtful. I just tell her what we're low on and she gets it. We have a garden. The younger children work in it. That's where we get our vegetables. She's not keen on me making new things. I see. Perhaps I shall make a list. Do you think you might find me a pen, ink and paper? There's some of that in the schoolroom that I could bring to you, but she only buys what we always have to eat, Annabel said again. I see. When will she go shopping again? End of the week, miss. It's always the end of the week. I see. Does she leave you in charge? She and him are the only ones ever in charge. And the children were so thoroughly intimidated, Charity guessed, that there was no danger of them even trying to leave. How could they, if they had grown up in this place and knew no other home? Moreover, if there was no nearby village, there was no sanctuary for the children to seek, even if they did wish to escape. What a dreadful fate for children, Charity thought, as she lay in bed that night, fighting to stave off the feelings of despair which threatened to overwhelm her as she pondered her own fate. What was to become of her? As much as she loathed the sight of Bertrand Althorp, she almost wished that she could see him so that she would know what was going on. Had her grandmother been contacted regarding the cause of Charity's disappearance? Would she ever see her family again? And, her spirits ebbing even lower, what of Lord Nicholas? Had he already forgotten her? Or was he so incensed at the accusations against him that she had made in her note to Christopher that he did not care what became of her? Was it frivolous of her to yearn for Lord Nicholas when her circumstances were such that she was doomed to marry Bertrand Althorp? Sleep did not come easily that night, and Charity was awake when she heard noises on the grounds of the foundling home. Silently, she got up from her bed and, barefooted, stole to the window and peered out behind the curtain. She watched as Bertrand Althorp and another man got out of an undistinguished carriage with no crest or markings on it to indicate that it belonged to anyone of high degree. They stood outside of it, apparently waiting. As Charity watched, she saw Mrs. Nelson emerge onto the scene, her arm supporting someone. Charity saw Mr. Althorp and the other gentleman take the girl, who stumbled as Mrs. Nelson released her and put her into the carriage. But before she disappeared from view, Charity's eyes widened as the other gentleman removed the hood from the girl and pinched her cheek with a leer that was plainly visible in the moonlight. Then the man handed something to Mr. Althorp, who took the banknotes and counted them before putting them into his coat pocket. Charity gasped and moved away from the window, not out of fear of being seen, but from the dismay at what she had witnessed. Was this what became of the girls at the foundling home who were unlucky enough to be regarded as pretty? Were they sold to men like this one, and did the Althorp profit from the transaction? Charity returned to her bed, but not to sleep. She realized that she must find a way to free the girls from this unconscionable destiny. Perhaps the boys were apprenticed to tradesmen, as Mr. Althorp had told her when he first described the foundling home, but the market for pretty girls was a different enterprise indeed. How many girls had been lost to this vile trade, Charity did not know, but she had to find a way to get herself and the girls away. She awoke earlier than usual the next morning and saw a carriage pulling away from the grounds. Mrs. Nelson, she guessed, out on her shopping errands. Sarah, bringing in the breakfast tray, confirmed that Mrs. Nelson had left that morning. "Perhaps she will bring back treats for all of you," Charity suggested as her fingers flew busily over the apron she was sewing. "We don't get treats," Sarah said, matter-of-factly. "She leaves us a list of chores to do." "Sarah, do you want to go into service?" The frightened look that Charity had observed when she first broached the subject returned to Sarah's eyes. "No, miss." "Is it because the service is not what it ought to be?" Sarah did not reply. "Are you trained in cooking and cleaning?" "Yes, miss, but—" "There is work in London for housemaids, you know. Do you never think of seeking work there?" "How will we get there, miss? She takes the horses when she goes to town for shopping. There's too many of us." 20, Nora told me, Charity recalled, down to 18 with the departure of Nora and the unnamed girl Charity had seen last night. Sarah nodded. "More or less, depending." "Depending on which girl's been taken?" Sarah's eyes darted back and forth, fearful that, even though there was no one else in the room, she was in danger of being overheard. "Sarah, I know what is going on," Charity said. "It is vile. The perpetrators of this evil must be stopped. Miss?" "Sarah, where are all the children?" "The boys be outside, in the garden, or doing chores. The girls are cleaning. Annabel is in the kitchen preparing lunch." "How old is the youngest child?" 5, miss." 5. That was very young, far too young to be able to make a journey on foot. London was miles away. "Sarah, the girl who was taken last night?" "Margaret, miss." Sarah supplied the name in a leaden intonation. "It is wrong, you know, for such things to happen." "There's nothing else for the likes of us, miss." "Who told you that?" "She did. We don't have parents, no mothers nor fathers, and we're to be grateful that we have a place here. We're lucky, she says, that anyone wants us at all." "That is a hideous untruth, Sarah. There are orphans all over England who have grown to be adults, and they are not expected to be grateful because an evil man and a sinful woman take advantage of their vulnerability. Sarah, we must all leave this place, and we must all leave this place, and we must do it today while Mrs. Nelson is away." Sarah's eyes grew enormous. "Leave, miss. We can't leave." "Why not?" Charity demanded. "Where would we go?" Anywhere would be better than this place, Charity thought, but she did not say so. She did not know where they were, or how far away they were from London. She knew no way of finding a safe place, and a grown woman travelling with a group of children was certain to invite attention, and Charity smiled. Attention. That was the one thing the Althorps dared not attract. It was possible that strangers would discount the words of children, but would anyone disregard the testimony of the granddaughter of the Dowager Duchess of Cavendish? "Sarah, will you ask Annabel to come up here?" "Miss," Sarah's expression revealed a frail but flickering hope that somehow there was reason to believe that deliverance was at hand. "Please ask her to come up to see me right away." "Miss, do you have a plan?" "Yes, Sarah, I have a plan." It was a makeshift plan, born of desperation and inspiration and prayer, but Annabel, unlike Sarah, was more hopeful. Within an hour she had prepared knapsacks for all of the children containing food for them to eat on a journey of an unknown duration. The children were brought together in the common area. For the first time since she had been brought to the foundling home, Charity, dressed once again in her own clothes and bonnet, was freed from her bedchamber. The children were instructed to put on their shoes, an item of attire which they seldom wore during the summer. The younger children were told that they were going on an adventure. The older children were privately told by Sarah and Annabel that they were escaping. Charity thought her heart might break when she noticed the way that the older children looked upon her, seeing in her a hope that they almost did not dare to nurture. "We shall have to walk amongst the trees," she told them, "so that we will not be seen too soon. We want to travel as far from here as we can until we can find a village with a constable who will be able to help us. We must also avoid notice until we are far enough away from this place, for we do not know how the Althorps are regarded by the neighbouring communities." "Miss," said one of the boys, "my brother is apprenticed to the barrel-maker what lives in Maidenton. It's not a long journey by horse." "Is your brother happy in his apprenticeship?" "No, miss. He wrote me a letter and said his master beats him." Then Maidenton was not a village which was likely to be supportive of her accusations. But if the boy knew the way, it would provide them with a direction in which to head, and from there they could make their way to the next town, where there might be a local law enforcement officer who would be willing to listen to what she said, or at least someone who would deliver a message to the Dowager Duchess of Cavendish. They set off, trudging along the way, each younger child paired with an older one and Charity in the lead. At her side was the boy whose brother was apprenticed to the barrel-maker. Charity resolved that she would find a way to have the brother released from his apprenticeship. Grandmamma would know a way. The children walked without complaint, and it was Charity who had them stop along the way. As they approached Maidenton, she and the children no longer walked along the road, but instead kept to the forest along the way, hiding within the shade of the trees, unseen. "What is the next village?" Charity asked as they found a spot in the forest for lunch, near a stream where they could have water to drink. The children weren't sure. One of the girls had heard that there was a town called Garver's Ferry past Maidenton, but Annabel said the next town was Martindale. "It's a bigger town than Maidenton, miss. They have horse races there." "Horse races. Let us pray that they are having one today," Charity said. "Why, miss?" Annabel asked curiously. "Because where there are horse races, there are riders," she said, "and amongst those riders there may be a gentleman who knows my grandmother and will take us to her." "Who's your granny, miss?" Charity smiled at the thought of Grandmamma being referred to as her granny. "My grandmother is Lady Claridge, the Dowager Duchess of Cavendish," she said proudly. "She will be able to help us and to find places for all of you." "Cavendish," piped up one of the boys. "Cavendish is along the river." "Yes, Cavendish is located upon the river." Charity nodded eagerly. "You know it." "I should say so," the boy continued. "My kin were from there. They died in a fever some years back." Chapter 12. The Journey. They continued walking. Charity considered the geography of their route. She had grown up on the Cavendish estate, and the names of the towns the children had told her of were not unfamiliar to her, but they were still not as close to her country home as she would have liked. She feared for the children's ability to continue walking such a distance. But they did not complain, and when they stopped again, Annabel commented that Mrs. Nelson would be arriving at the home before dark. "I hope that we shall be at Cavendish before dark," Charity said. "Some of the sights are beginning to look somewhat familiar." "She'll note that we're gone," Annabel said, apprehension apparent in her voice. She'll send for him. Yes, but it will take her a certain amount of time to get a message to Mr. Althorp in London, Charity said confidently. We shall be at Cavendish before then. Do you think so, miss? Oh, yes, Charity said. With every step they trod, she had felt more and more sure of her decision and its success. She was still afraid, but she was imbued with a sense of what Papa would have called the faith in things unseen. Then what's to become of us? Annabel asked, getting the question out before she was overtaken by a cough. Charity, her heart swelled with pity for this poor, ill, brave girl, waited until the coughing fit ended. My grandmother shall find places for all of you, she said. Safe places where you will be able to work and keep your money. There is an orphanage in the village where I grew up. It is run by the vicar and his wife, who see to it that the children are raised properly. My parents, when they were alive, worked in the orphanage as well, looking after the children. My father taught them their Christian faith and my mother taught them their lesson. But, miss, I'm too old for an orphanage. But you are a cook, Annabel, Charity assured her. My grandmother will find a place for you. But first we must have a physician see to your cough. You may need to rest for a time, perhaps by the seaside, so that your health is restored to you. There's no one will hire such as me, Annabel said. She always told me so. Perhaps the orphanage will need the services of a cook who is used to cooking for a large group of children. Do not despair, Annabel. We are away from that dreadful place, and I promise you my grandmother will not turn anyone away. Is she a fine lady? The finest lady I know, Charity affirmed. The summer days held the light long, and this allowed the group to continue their journey, even though they were weary. But by now, Charity recognized the surroundings and strode forward with confidence, feeling a kinship with every forest glade and sloping green hill as they passed these landmarks of her childhood. We are not far, children, she turned around to call back to them. Then she heard the pounding of horses' hooves behind them. Quickly, children, she said, into the forest where we can hide. The children scampered into the trees at her word, galvanized by the urgency in her voice. She took her place among them, watching the road, her heart pounding in fear. There was no way that Mr. Althorp could possibly have been alerted so fast. No way, unless he had accompanied Mrs. Nelson back to the foundling home. She had not considered this possibility. She waited with dread as the horses drew nearer. There was more than one rider, and it was unlikely that Mrs. Nelson was of the party, considering the galloping pace of the horses. Had Mr. Althorp already managed to raise the alarm, and was the law already doing his bidding to find the children? The children, even the youngest, were as still and quiet, as if they sensed the danger of the moment. Likely they did, Charity thought. They were accustomed to living in fear. The horses drew nearer, their hooves thundering on the road. Charity peered out from the branches of the trees. She saw two men approaching, astride chestnut mounts. Both men were hatless, attesting to the pace of their riding. Then Charity saw the bright golden hair of the rider, who was slightly ahead of the other one, and she ran forward out of the trees. "Stop!" she exclaimed as the children huddled closer together, terrified at her actions. The riders reined in their horses. "Cuz," said Christopher, sliding down off his horse's back, "what the devil are you doing out here? We've been searching for you everywhere." Lord Nicholas, no slower but more graceful in his descent from his horse, approached her. "Miss Gambler," he said, his intonation as genial as ever, but his expression more serious than she had ever beheld it. "I do not know how all of this has come to pass, but—" "Children, it is all right," Charity said, cutting him off as she turned around to summon the children. "We are saved!" Christopher and Lord Nicholas watched in disbelief as the trees emitted a stream of children of all ages, wearing drab clothing and showing signs of weariness, clustered around Charity. "Are we at Cavendish, miss?" asked Annabel. "We are close enough, Annabel. This is my cousin, Lord Claridge, and Miss Gambler's fiancé, Lord Nicholas, returned the interruption, giving the gaping children a sweeping bow with his introduction. Charity turned in surprise. "You have forgiven me," she said in surprise. "Certainly not," he declared. "You have caused me nights of worry, and days of exertion, and I suspect that I shall never forgive you." He grinned at her. "Your grandmother has had men out combing the country for you. We never thought to look so close to Cavendish." "We have been walking all day," she told them. "We have escaped from the foundling home." "So that is where that blackguard was hiding you," Christopher said. "I wish I had him in front of me now." "You'd have to wait until I was done with him," Lord Nicholas said grimly. "There's no sign of him in London. We've had the authorities looking everywhere." "His aunt is back at the foundling home, or should be," Charity said. "She left to shop for supplies. The foundling home is in an abandoned village near Maidenton. The Althorps are even worse than you might think." Quickly, she told him of the purpose for which the pretty girls were used. "I believe the boys are apprenticed, but their masters may not be very kind. We must rescue the 2 girls who were taken, and we must also redeem the apprenticeship of one of the boys who is in service to a barrel maker in Maidenton." First, Lord Nicholas said, "we must get these children to safety. They look as if they're about to fall down where they stand. Kit, will you go to Cavendish and explain to your grandmother? With a couple of wagons and drivers, we can bring this motley crew to the estate and feed them, then find beds for them for night. Charity, you'd better come with me. Grandmamma will want to see for herself that you are well." "I cannot leave the children," she said. "You go quickly, and will continue to wait in the forest. But please go quickly," she begged. "It's getting dark and I don't want the children to be afraid." Once the children were back in the forest, Charity instructed them to eat the remaining food in their knapsacks. Lord Nicholas, sitting down on the grass with them as if he had no concern for the condition of his buckskins, soon had them all in laughter as he said that he was perishing from hunger and might be tempted to steal from their stash of food. Charity, who had not heard the children laugh at all during the journey, marvelled that Lord Nicholas could so easily rouse them to mirth. The children offered to share their food with him, even though little was left, but he said that he could not take it because he hadn't enough blunt on him to pay for the meal. When one of them protested that she would give it to him, Lord Nicholas's hands went into his pockets. He bought a morsel of food from each child's provisions, handing each a coin in exchange. As none of the children had ever had money of their own before, and he had taken so little of their food, the boys and girls felt that they had made the better part of the bargain. My lord," Charity said when the children were eagerly finishing their food, energised by the promise that a full meal awaited them once they were at the Cavendish estate. "We must find places for these children. I have told them that the orphanage in the village will find homes for the youngest ones. It is run by the vicar and his wife. My parents assisted there when they were in the parish. The older children will want positions in households. The girls have learned to cook and clean and sew. They can be taken on as housemaids. The boys can be apprenticed to tradesmen. And we must find the 2 girls, Nora and Margaret." "You have quite an agenda for someone who has only just escaped from captivity in a foundling home," Lord Nicholas said. "It must be done," she replied earnestly. "These children are blameless. I only hope that Mr. Althorp and his father and aunt shall pay for their crime." "They shall pay handsomely, I assure you. Peyton Althorp is already in custody and the search continues for his son. He shall not escape. Your grandmother is no coward. As soon as she received his note, she contacted the authorities privately. You may be surprised to know that others have been suspicious of the Althorp before now. There were rumours that the foundling home was merely a means of profit for Peyton Althorp. What was believed by the public to be a charitable foundling home, which of course no one had ever seen or visited, was in truth a means for gentlemen of means to rid themselves of inconvenient blows. It was blackmail, pure and simple, but the gentlemen participated in the ruse using the alibi that they were providing funds for the support of the children. "What of you?" Charity asked directly. "My gambling losses, do you mean? Miss Gambler," he said with a wide smile, "I may be a rogue, but I'm a deuced fine card player. There are members of the government who wanted to know the truth about Althorp's goings on before he rose any further up the political ladder. They enlisted me to help, with the requirement that I must lose to Althorp, who has been plying his card skills for some time. I engineered losses at the government's behest. Unfortunately, this led you to believe that I was in Althorp's debt and desperate for funds. I regret that he used this means to convince you that I was planning to abduct you so that I might take hold of your inheritance. I am so sorry, Lord Nicholas. He was so convincing." "I dare say. Please remember for the future that for all my sins, I have not yet had to resort to force to obtain the attentions of a female. However, having fallen in love with the one female who seemed resistant to whatever charms I thought I had, I told your grandmother that I had had enough of this letting a chit of 18 choose her husband, and that when we finally found you, we would be married as soon as the banns may be read. Otherwise, I told her I would take you to Gretna Green myself. Charity laughed. What did Grandmama say? She said that she'd meet us in Scotland. She has fond memories of her own marriage in Gretna Green, and thought that, as marital traditions go, it is not such a bad one to replicate. But now that you have been found, I must ask you in the traditional manner to be my wife. I am so enamoured of you, and your surname, that I will not be content until you and I are wed. What do you say? I would go down on one knee to propose, but as we are already sitting on the grass, there is no point in doing further damage to my trousers. Will you marry me, so that together you and I may become gamblers in love together with each other? I warn you, Miss Gambler, that after you accept my proposal, I intend to kiss you in front of all these children, and you shall have to marry me, or they shall be aghast at the licence that I have taken. Charity leaned forward. If you do not kiss me, she told him sternly, then I shall doubt your intentions. If I am a gambler by name, and you are a rogue by nature, we might as well defy convention together. The children were not at all aghast to see the two kiss. They were fascinated. Don't they have to stop to breathe? Asked one boy curiously. Annabel hushed him, but the remark caused both Charity and Lord Nicholas to laugh until Lord Nicholas, announcing that he had recovered his breath sufficiently, intended to kiss his fiancée again, which he did, enfolding a pink-cheeked Charity in his arms, to the great entertainment of his young audience.
The end. Thank you for listening. Here at PureRead, we aim to serve you, our dear readers and listeners, with good, clean Christian stories. You can be assured that any PureRead book you pick up will not only be hugely enjoyable but free of any objectionable content. We are deeply thankful to you for choosing our books. Your support means that we can continue to provide stories like the one you have just listened to. Please like and subscribe to our channel. That way you'll be the first to hear when new stories arrive for your enjoyment. To browse our range of clean and wholesome titles, go to pureread.com. God bless you and thank you again for listening.